Better? Yes, no, folks in the back row. Yeah? Carla, I'm seeing you nodding. You can hear? Okay, very good. All right, welcome everybody. Good afternoon. Welcome to the 100th annual meeting of the International Pacific Halibut Commission. It's an honor for the United States to host this year's meeting, and to the Canadian delegation, welcome to Anchorage. I hope you get a chance to explore while you're here, whether it's on the local ski trails or just walking around downtown. Most of the U.S. attendees get to Anchorage quite frequently, so don't hesitate to ask us if you need any local pointers. It is remarkable to think about the IPHC being in existence for a full century, and we'll be celebrating that milestone this evening at a reception generously hosted by members of the halibut industry, and we'll hear more about IPHC's history and accomplishments then. For now, as this year's chair of the commission, I'll just note how much I appreciate IPHC's strong foundation in science, the professionalism and accomplishments of the Secretariat staff, and contributions of supporting agencies from Canada and the United States, including federal, state, and provincial governments, and the incredible engagement of halibut users and stakeholders who are involved in commercial, charter, recreational, and personal use fisheries, processing, tribes and First Nations who participate in subsistence use of halibut, and more. During my very short time as a commissioner, I've just been really impressed with everyone's engagement and commitment to sustainable management of the halibut resource. We're facing some serious challenges, including the current status of the halibut resource in a period of weak recruitment, and some big budget challenges in funding the annual survey for halibut and other components of IPHC's mission. But I know we will work through those challenges together, and I look forward to our discussions this week. Paul, anything you want to add just to kick us off?
Yeah, thanks very much, John. I think you've covered everything that I was going to say one way or the other. Besides, you know, it's good to be here in Anchorage again. As you said, it's somewhat remarkable that now we're at 100 years. My short time in here has been maybe 10 years, so only 10%. But it's very clear that this is very important to all the folks in the room and those online. We value the input that we receive from people to help us better manage this resource, and I look forward to hearing some more at this meeting. Thanks very much.
Okay, thank you, Paul. With that, I'd like to invite Mr. Aaron Leggett, the first chief of the native village of Eklutna, to offer a land acknowledgement. Mr. Leggett.
Yali Ethland Shishida Aaron Leggett Gashtanak, she Chada Danainak, she Nolchinatlan, Chu Idla Rat Skach di Shtukta, Rick Leggett, Shunkta, Diane Bowles. Hello, everybody. Again, my name is Aaron Leggett. I have the honor of being the president of the Native Village of Eklutna. The Native Village of Eklutna is the only federally and now state-recognized tribe here in the municipality of Anchorage, and it's my honor to welcome this group here today. And with that, I wanted to I have a PowerPoint here to kind of situate you to the place, talk a little bit about our history, and give you a greater sense of who the Dena'ina people are and where you are now, which unfortunately halibut don't play a large role in our subsistence use in this area, but certainly our relatives down further down on the Kenai Peninsula and especially into Kachemak Bay use that resource still to this day. So somebody can bring up my PowerPoint. Anybody know any good jokes? There we go. And will I be able to advance the slides, or do I need to tell somebody? I guess I could try. There we go. Cool. So this talk here is called Dena'ina Bada Ina Kol Kalan, which means who are the Dena'ina? So the Dena'ina are one of 11 Athabascan or Dene speaking people here in Alaska. You can see all those red colors are Athabascan or Dene people, and they extend into Canada and also down along the lower 48 down in the southwest. The Navajo and the Apache are also a Dene speaking people. What's unique about the Dena'ina is that we're the only northern Athabascans who live on saltwater, so it stands to reason we knew what halibut were. We were the first Athabascans in Alaska to come in contact with Europeans, and today half of Alaska's population lives within our traditional homeland, and until very recently, few people knew that we still existed. The Dena'ina probably came from the interior of Alaska maybe over 1,000 years ago onto Cook Inlet in a series of migrations. We're divided into 4 mutually intelligible dialects: the Upper Cook Inlet Dena'ina, my people from around this area; the Outer Inlet Dena'ina along the Kenai Peninsula and the other side of Cook Inlet; the Iliamna Dena'ina are the Dena'ina that lived around Lake Iliamna; and the Inland Dena'ina are the Dena'ina furthest from saltwater but live around Lake Clark and the upper Stony River and Mulchatna area. So since we lived on saltwater, how did we travel? Well, we used skin boats, which we call badi. This is a picture of Nick Californsky and Simeon Chikalushin paddling somewhere in the Kenai Mountains in the 1920s. This is Nick's son, Peter Californsky, along with other Kenaitze Dena'ina elders, actually building one of these skin boats in the late 1980s. There's the completed boat, give you a sense of the size. These were used for traveling on the open ocean across Cook Inlet and the larger lakes like Kenai Lake and Iliamna and Lake Clark. We also used the Bakindin or skin kayak. We borrowed this technology from the Sukpiak or Alutiiq-speaking people down further on Cook Inlet and the Alaska Peninsula and Kodiak Island. These are a couple of Kenai Dena'ina at Seldovia in Kachemak Bay about the beginning of the 20th century. Here you can see the frame of one of these kayaks near the Humpy Village, which is near Kasilof, near Kenai, about 1890. Here's another picture of one stored under a cache at that same location. This is a picture of Chief Evan on the Susitna River about 1910 using it. And we have some Iliamna Dena'ina on Lake Iliamna also around the same time. So although we borrowed the kayak technology, we did create our own technology adapted to saltwater, found nowhere else in Alaska. One of these is called the Yoi Kol. This is a beluga spearing platform. What the Dena'ina would do is they would wait till the tides went out along the mud flats of Cook Inlet where belugas tend to congregate. They would take a very large spruce tree, knock it down, leaving the roots intact, and then flip the tree upside down, anchor it into the mud, and then a hunter would climb up, sit on the perch, wait for the belugas to swim by. He'd harpoon them, and then he would signal to the crew that's waiting near the shore, and they would chase after the whale and bring it in. If you guys get a chance and you're flying through Anchorage, when you just clear security at the Anchorage airport, you can see this diorama that's still up in the airport. Contact with outsiders. So the Tachnaina are what the Dena'ina called the first Europeans to come into this area. That means the underwater people. Oral tradition says the reason they were called the underwater people is that when they saw the first Cook's boats coming into this area at a large distance, because of the horizon, it looked like the boat would appear and then disappear and come back up. So in May of 1778, Captain Cook, sailing for the British Crown, was looking for the fabled Northwest Passage. It's fitting, of course, we're at the Captain Cook Hotel. So you can see more of that history throughout this building. These are some images taken or drawn during the expedition. But he also collected objects. Of course, when Captain Cook came into this area, he thought he'd finally found the fabled Northwest Passage. Unfortunately, when he got to the head of what he called Cook's River, which later became Cook Inlet, he realized that it was a dead end. And he then went up another bay that he thought maybe was the Northwest Passage. And again, he got stuck, and so he had to turn his boat again. So that's why it's called turning an arm. But if you read Cook's journals, he wasn't really impressed with this area. It was late May, early June, 1778. Said to be pretty cold that year. It's pretty gray. He wasn't too impressed. So he spent about 2 weeks here. He sent his crew looking around, interacted with the Dena'ina, did a little bit of trading, but Cook never actually got off the boat. So I like to say he was the first cruise ship passenger to Cook Inlet. Of course, later he sailed out of this area. He went around the Alaska Peninsula, sailed up into the Bering Sea, and then came back down and decided he was going to go back to the Hawaiian Islands, where he had been treated so well a few years earlier. Of course, we know how that ended, and it didn't end well for Cook. Nevertheless, many of the objects that he collected found their way back to Britain, and some of these pieces are still owned by the British Museum. This is a sheep horn spoon or ladle that he collected. This is what Dena'ina summer clothing looked like pre-contact or early contact. It was made from tan caribou hide with woven porcupine quills for embroidery to create these complex geometric patterns. This is a men's tunic. This is a women's dress. There you can see a detailed shot of this incredibly intricate design work that was done. An arrow quiver collected by Cook on that expedition would have had feathers originally on it, but over the last 200 and something years, bugs have eaten the feathers off. There you can see a detailed shot of the quiver and some of the embroidery. So after contact, we got access to glass beads in trade. You can still see the geometric patterning. This was collected probably in the 1880s in this area around Kinnick Arm. There's a detailed shot of it. They also would paint using red ochre as a pigment to depict various hunting scenes and different animals. To me, I interpret this piece as a bit of a transition going, you can see the hunter on the top using a bow, and looks to me like the hunter on the bottom is using a flintlock or a matchlock rifle. So when I was a kid, this is what I was taught about my heritage. In 1778, Captain Cook, sailing for the British Crown, sailed up into this area and quote unquote discovered the inlet. This statue's on the corner of 3rd and F Street. And if you walk through downtown Anchorage, you'd have a real hard time knowing anything about the Dena'ina, with the exception of part of a historical walking tour of Anchorage on the corner of 3rd and F Street was a little 3-sided sign. And at the bottom of the sign, after talking quite a bit about Captain Cook, in the bottom corner, there's a little mention of the Dena'ina Indians of Cook Inlet. Dena'ina being an older spelling of Dena'ina. What happened is when our name was recorded by the Russians, they wrote it down. It was then translated to German, and then from German to English. And so the D became a T. So if you looked at this sign, it said the Tenina Indians who lived in the Cook Inlet region when Captain Cook arrived on these shores had probably been here no more than a few generations. Archaeologists believe the Pacific Eskimo people dominated this area, at least seasonally, until about 1700. Well, this was based on one archaeologist's opinion in the late 1960s at one site, and we know this to be false. We have sites dated at least back 1,000 years. The second thing it said, in 1839, nearly half the population of Native people living around Cook Inlet was killed in a terrible smallpox epidemic. That is true from 1836 to 1839. About half our population was wiped out. The next thing says, these Teninas living near the town of Knik were photographed in 1906. So it's sort of like, we were on the endangered species list or we didn't exist, like a Tasmanian devil or something. But we're still here. So the Dena'ina name for Cook Inlet is Tikachnu or Tikatnu. It means big water river. Again, it's interesting that Cook thought this was also a river, and you can see on this map that was done by his crew, it's called Cook's River, and then the river Turnagain. The Dena'ina name for Turnagain Arm is Tutslo. It means backwater. Another Dena'ina name for Knik Arm or for Cook Inlet is Nuti. Nuti literally translates as salt or salt water. This map here shows the municipality of Anchorage, and all these little red dots represent Dena'ina place names and locations within the Anchorage Bowl. There have been about 2,100 Dena'ina names that have been recovered throughout the entire region. About 2 blocks from here, we have Ship Creek, the Dena'ina called Da'gaitnu. It means needlefish, or for you scientists out there, it's the 3-spined stickleback. It's a very interesting species, but Dena'ina oral tradition says that the 3-spined stickleback was an important subsistence resource, especially in the late spring, early summer, before the arrival of the king salmon. It's said that in years that were incredibly lean, that you could go to Da'gaitnu, middle to the end of April and catch these fish. This is an artistic rendition that was done for a sign down there. They must have been catching these by the tens of thousands, and they would boil them up and make a fish soup out of them. Another unique technology that only exists in Cook Inlet is called the Tani Kadi. It's sort of like a dip netting platform or kind of like scaffolding. This would be constructed out into the inlet. And the beauty of this system is that the people could continue fishing anytime the tides were in or out. They could work their way up and continue fishing and do it safely. This is one of the locations near the port of Anchorage, just north of the small boat harbor and Ship Creek, at a place called Takat. The fish camp was located right about here where that hill is. This was used up until World War II, when it was taken over by the military and made part of Fort Richardson and Elmendorf. And the bluff here is where the Army used to, the Air Force used to push all the garbage off there and dump it down on the fish camp. Another important location was Chanchnu. Chanchnu means grass creek. When the early map makers came through, they found Dena'ina along Chanchnu after they'd been displaced from Da'gaitnu. And they asked them, what do you guys call this area? We said Chanchnu. They wrote it down as Chester. We said, close enough. So in Anchorage, Chester Creek or Westchester Lagoon comes from the Dena'ina name Chanchnu. There was no Old Man Chester that had a whiskey still or anything like that. Some pioneer early Anchorage settler. Nope, it comes from Chanchnu. There's a picture of my great-great-grandfather holding one of my great-great-aunts, and my great-great-uncle standing next to him, and my great-great-grandmother, taken about 1923, we believe, at Chanchnu. We can date this photo based on when I know when these people were born. Another important location, both for subsistence and later for commercial fishing in Anchorage, was Nuchishtunt, the place protected from the wind It's relatively close to the Anchorage airport today. Point Warrenzoff is what it's called in English. There's a picture of Eklutna Dena'ina people fishing commercially there in the late 1940s. The last location on Cook Inlet that was still used by the village for subsistence and some commercial fishing was off of Fire Island. This is a picture of another one of my great-great-uncles, Mike Alex, the late chief of Eklutna, fishing about 1975. So things started to change in 2006. The city of Anchorage was building a $110 million convention center, and there was questions of what should it be named. After a local naming committee was put together, Dena'ina people petitioned that instead of naming it after an individual, that it should be named after the indigenous people of this area. We were able to persuade them to that recommendation, and ultimately it was passed by the Anchorage Assembly unanimously, and so the Dena'ina Civic and Convention Center sits a few blocks from here. Also inside the building, there's artwork depicting Dena'ina lifeways and lifestyle. This is the late Tanana Athabascan artist James Grant. And this spurred the Anchorage Museum, and my work with the museum started around this time when the museum decided that it wanted to do an exhibition on the indigenous population of the area. So for 7 years, we worked on the exhibition Dena'ina Huch Uliyashi, the Dena'ina Way of Living. When he came into the exhibition, we had a recreation of a Dena'ina fish camp based on the Evanoff family fish camp at Non-Dalton. Here you can see some of that clothing. These came from the National Museum of Finland that were on loan to the Anchorage Museum during that time. Also throughout, at the end of the exhibition, we had a historic timeline that takes you from pre-contact all the way up to, at that time, 2013, as well as an interactive map of Anchorage showing some of the locations that I mentioned to you before. If you want to know more, there's also a wonderful book called Dena'ina Huch Uliyashi, the Dena'ina Way of Living. It's available, I think, on Amazon or through the Anchorage Museum's website or at the Anchorage Museum in our store. This continued work at the Anchorage Museum to recognize that this is Dena'ina Elfnena. Elfnena means the traditional homeland or country, and we've put that up throughout the building. Also, at the beginning of every one of our exhibitions, we do a land acknowledgement that recognizes this is the traditional homeland of the Eklutna Dena'ina, and we explain what land acknowledgements are and how we're working towards giving that respect to the indigenous populations. There's also interpretive signage throughout many of the parks. Here, this is up at Glen Alps, up in the mountains. It's talking about a traditional mountain story told by the Dena'ina. I'm also proud to say that the Native Village of Eklutna works very closely with the military. They truly understand what government-to-government relationships are. And a few years ago, I had suggested that wouldn't it be great if when you come onto the base, that we had signage that recognizes the Dena'ina people's homeland and the relationship between the military and the Native Village. There you can see it installed. Also, down along the small boat harbor in Anchorage, we were able to put up a Dena'ina statue as part of some mitigation for a stalled project called the Knik Arm Crossing and the port expansion. And leading off of that, another project that I'm currently involved in is called the Indigenous Place Name Markers. This is a project where we wanted to put up 32 interpretive markers in many of those locations that you saw earlier, and different levels at which we were hoping to do that. Currently, we have 4 installed. We've kind of put them into different phases. These are the first 10, kind of in the most visible locations throughout the Anchorage Bowl. These are kind of more remote locations, but still accessible. And then we also imagined what would it be like in certain strategic locations if we had more of a plaza installation. Here you can see one of these markers down at Westchester Lagoon at Chanchnu. The lagoon was actually created in the late 1960s when they blocked off the river and it backfills. But if you open up the gate, which they do every few years to drain it out, you can still see where the river or the creek exists. This is at the other end of Chonchnu, up in northeast Anchorage at Chonchnu Muldoon Park, near the Alaska Native Heritage Center. A lot of mitigation work went there to restore salmon habitat. And in November of 2021, during Alaska Native American Heritage Month, this project was featured on the front page of the Washington Post, so it got national attention. And part of that national attention, we were asked to reach out. We were contacted by the Mellon Foundation to apply for a project that they're doing called the Monuments Project, commemorative landscape and public places. And in September, early October, we got word that we were successful for $1.7 million to complete the other 28 signs throughout the Anchorage Bowl, and we have to do that in about the next 4 years. So with that, on the front of the Anchorage Museum, if you get a chance to check it out, you can see that this is Denina Elfnena. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Chief Leggett. Really appreciate that, and it's an honor to be on Denina land. Thank you very much. With that, I'd like to invite Mayor Dave Bronson, Mayor of Anchorage, to come and welcome us. Mr. Mayor.
Well, thank you, Chief. I learned something every time you talk about this, and very informative. I just want folks to recognize as well as the Eklutna Tribe and the Eklutna Corporation are the single largest landholders within the city of Anchorage, and they've traditionally been great partners, and we really look forward to working with them again indefinitely. So anyways, well, welcome to the 100th annual meeting of the International Pacific Halibut Commission. On behalf of the folks of Anchorage, we really welcome you here. For you folks in the lower 48th, just for your benefit, we ordered this weather to warm you up a little bit. So, but it's an honor here to stand before you today as we mark a century of collaboration, dedication, and shared commitment to the sustainable management of Pacific halibut. As we reflect on the past 100 years, we acknowledge the profound impact this commission has had on the conservation and stewardship of one of our most valuable marine fisheries. From the early days of the IPHC to the present, your collective efforts have shaped policies, conducted vital research, and ensured that the Pacific halibut remains a symbol of responsible fisheries management. Pacific halibut is a crucial component of Alaska's economy. It supports the livelihoods of many Alaska fishermen, many of whom are here, and it also supports many seafood-related businesses. The commercial fishing industry, including halibut, contributes significantly to the state's economy, something you all know. And it also has cultural significance as it plays a vital role in the traditional diets of indigenous communities. The work of the IPHC contributes to preserving a staple of Alaska's economy, culture, and community, and let's not forget preserving the quality and taste of the halibut we eat down at F Street Station and Humpy's. So thank you for being a part of this important gathering. Your presence underscores the importance of our collective responsibility towards the oceans and reinforces the significance of the International Pacific Halibut Commission. Here's to a productive, insightful, and memorable 100th anniversary. Thank you very much and welcome to our great city.
All right, thank you very much, Mr. Mayor. So I think that brings us to adoption of our agenda and arrangements for the session. Dr. Wilson, any announcements or logistical arrangements before we adopt the agenda?
Yeah, thank you very much, Chair. And as the agenda comes up on screen, just in terms of this evening, we're going to be adjourning by 5:30 at the latest, and the doors for the reception will open at 7 p.m. tonight, and it's going to be in these three meeting rooms. So once we finish here at 5:30, they're going to break everything down, open up the doors, and you're welcome to come down for the 100th reception starting from about 7 o'clock. We'll start off formal proceedings from about 7:45. So if you do want to take your time in coming down, please just make sure you're in before 7:45. Other than that, Chair, we can take a look at the agenda and see if there's anything the Commission would like to add or remove. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Commissioners, any changes to the agenda? Not seeing any. So let's adopt the agenda. And we can move to item 3.1, I believe, update on actions arising.
Thank you very much, Chair. So if we could have the presentation for paper 03, please. So under this agenda item 3, there are 7 different sections, and we're going to provide to you a number of core updates that the Secretariat and the subsidiary bodies have undertaken in the last 12 months or so. The first of that, 3.1, is an update on the actions arising, and this is the actions arising from the previous annual meeting, also any intersessional decisions, and there was also one special session. Those actions are outlined in the appendix to the paper. As I mentioned, there are a number of recommendations and requests for action from each of these 4 categories of previous Commission meetings. So the 99th session of the Commission meeting, the 12th special session, the 13th special session, a range of intersessional decisions that were undertaken, and then also more recently, or most recently, the interim meeting, which was held last December. I'm pleased to say that we have made significant progress on the majority. 31 of these requests and recommendations have been completed. But there are 6 that we are still working upon. Most of those are going to be spoken to by other presenters over the course of the next few days, and so it's not my intention to step through each of these. Just as an example, the one outstanding recommendation from the 99th session of the annual meeting relates to special circumstances with the management strategy evaluation work. And Dr. Hicks is going to present to you an update probably tomorrow morning. So for each of these recommendations and requests, you're going to receive specific updates and progress. So as I said, I don't intend on stepping through those specifically. But with that said, there was one additional request for action from the Commission to the Secretariat and to the contracting parties throughout the course of the year. And that was to develop a more or less a climate pledge, a statement on climate change. And to introduce and speak to that, I'm going to pass to the Chair, and in doing so, could the Secretariat please bring up information paper 02, please.
Okay, thank you, Dave. And that information paper 2, of course, is online on the IPHC website, along with all the meeting materials. So if folks want to follow along, you can. So as Dave indicated, early in 2023, Commissioner Ryall and Dave, the Executive Director, and I began discussing the development of a statement by the Commission on climate change. And the idea was to recognize explicitly the potential impacts of climate change on Pacific halibut, including effects on other species and other fisheries that may have implications for Pacific halibut management, and to make clear that the Commission will consider the impacts of climate change on halibut fisheries and stocks in its research and management decisions. A number of regional fishery management organizations around the world have developed measures or statements about climate change, and we reviewed a number of those and thought it quite appropriate for IPHC to do so as well. That gave rise to further discussions around this and the development of drafts, culminating in this document, which, as I said, is posted on the web with other materials for the meeting. And I'd like to thank Dave and the Secretariat for their work on this. And Dave, anything else to add about the statement?
No, Chair. I think you've covered it very well. It's a statement and a commitment from the broader Commission, and obviously with support from the Secretariat. With that, it would be for the commission to determine how you would like to handle the statement, whether you would like it published in a particular format on the website or associated media releases. And that should be enough. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, thank you. And I believe we need a motion to officially adopt the statement. So move. Motion from Commissioner Albertson. Is there a second? Commissioner Davis. Any discussion on the motion or comments?
Well, I echo your thanks to the Secretariat staff, John, and I'm glad we have this. I think Dr. Wilson's suggestion about, where do we want it to live is a good one, but I don't know we have discussed in any detail. So maybe that's a sort of an action item for us, is to figure out where this is most appropriate. That's my only comment. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. That's certainly something we can follow up on. Any other comments or discussion on the motion? If not, any objection to the motion? Okay, not seeing any objections, so the statement is adopted. Okay.
Thank you very much, Chair. And just for all stakeholders in the room, just an indication that we're also very committed to reporting out on how we are making progress in meeting this statement on climate change. We will be incorporating the principles contained within the statement, within the 5-year program of integrated research and monitoring. You're going to hear a little bit about that later this morning, and then also when Dr. Planas presents his update on the biological and ecosystem science program. So stay tuned. We'll keep you posted on our commitments and our progress. The next paper is paper 04, and so I could have the presentation brought up for paper 04, please. Okay, thank you. And so this is the standard report that the Secretariat provides to the Commission on the update on our activities that aren't already contained within other papers being presented to you throughout the course of the meeting. And so as part of this presentation, I'm going to run through a number of updates as well as Dr. Hutchinson, and so I'll pass to her at the appropriate time. In terms of the Secretariat itself, based in Seattle, we currently are composed of 28 full-time positions, so FTEs, and varying throughout the year, we have roughly 24 to 45, depending on the design and scope of the Fishery Independent Setline Survey. And so we'll hire those temporary field staff on an annual basis. As a broad shared vision for the Secretariat, we aim to deliver positive economic, environmental, and social outcomes for the Pacific halibut resource for both Canada and the US through the application of rigorous science, innovation, and the implementation of international best practices. And it's that statement, that vision, which really guides all of our activities, whether it be through our core monitoring and data collection activities, through to our internal governance and accountability to you, the stakeholders, and the Commission. The prompt is very small down below me, so it's hard to land on the target. In terms of overall structure, we did undergo a slight restructuring throughout the course of the last year with the Fisheries Policy Branch roles and responsibilities being merged with the Data Services Branch, and that is now our new Fisheries Regulations and Data Services Branch, which is led by Dr. Hutchinson. We ran our annual internship program. Another very successful individual joined us, William Lee. He joined us from the University of Washington, and in particular the Aquatic and Fisheries Sciences Department. And William worked very closely with Dr. Planas and his team, undertaking a number of support activities, both in terms of the Odorth Aging Services team at the Secretariat. He was also deployed on the Fishery Independent Setline Survey on the Star Wars, and also assisted Dr. Planas and his team with a project mapping the juvenile Pacific halibut. We will be running our internship program again in 2024. We are seeking 2 candidates, and so if you are aware of potential eligible or suitable individuals, please do remind them that we will be advertising for that internship program. And that is a paid internship program over the summer months at the Secretariat. 2024 was the interim year between our Merit Scholarship recipients. We make a call for candidates every 2 years, which means that in 2024, later this year, we'll be putting out another call for applications to our Merit Scholarship. If you recall, Miss Lucy Hankins was our most recent successful recipient of the IPHC Merit Scholarship. And I hear from all accounts that she's doing very well with her studies. So as I said, we're going to put out a call for the next Merit Scholarship position in March, so later this year. And so if you are aware of any youngsters who are up and coming and who would like to apply to the IPHC Merit Scholarship Program, please do keep your eyes and ears peeled for that announcement. In terms of the various meetings that we ran throughout 2023, we certainly ran in a hybrid format for most of our meetings, and we've noticed an uptick in remote participation. This provides both an enhanced opportunity for more stakeholders to be engaged in our meetings, but then also just allowing us to have greater reach to other interested parties that wouldn't normally attend our meetings, but with an online platform, they're able to listen in and see what activities the IPHC is undertaking. And I'll pass to Basha. Over to you.
Thank you. Annually, IPHC revises fishery regulations in accordance with adopted regulatory proposals. Last year, we had 8 regulatory proposals adopted by the Commission, of which 2 were adopted after minor revisions. These were related to mortality and fishery limits, commercial fishing periods, transition of management in IPHC Regulatory Area 2A, charter management measures in IPHC Regulatory Areas 2C and 3A, bag limits in IPHC Regulatory Area 2B, onboard consumption in Alaska, as well as log requirements in IPHC Regulatory Area 2A. Fishery Regulations and Data Services Branch is also closely following actions at the regional levels that are relevant to Pacific halibut. On the Canadian side, the IPHC is participating as a member of the Halibut Advisory Board. We have also obtained a multi-year permit for IPHC Fishery Independent Setline Survey to fish in Waihanas National Marine Conservation Area, and this permit is valid through this year. We are also participating in the discussions on the troll electronic monitoring in Canada, and pending pilot review that has been the pilot has been happening this year. Expansion of this program will be considered. On the United States side, we are for the first time the annual management measures for the non-tribal directed commercial fishery in IPHC Regulatory Area 2A were implemented by NOAA Fisheries. The final rule implementing that transition was effective since 4th of January 2023. The final rule implementing the abundance-based management of Amendment 80 troll sector became effective on 1st of January 2024. We are also closely following actions at relevant councils, and a few of the actions that are worth highlighting include December 2023 meeting of the North Pacific Fisheries Management Council, when the Council recommended a suite of management measures for the charter sector in areas 2C and 3A, and we'll hear more about it as a part of the regulatory proposal B1. On the Pacific Fishery Management Council, there was a change to the structure and decisions for season structure for recreational fisheries in Area 2A and the directed commercial fishery in 2A. Moreover, there were some additional changes to the catching plan that include in-season process to provide more flexibility on the Area 2A non-treaty sport allocations. And as a part of these changes, there is a regulatory proposal B1 that accommodates that decisions so that the regulations align between the contracting party regulations and IPHC. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Basha. In terms of communications and outreach, the Secretariat continues to develop new ways to display the information and the data that we collect, analyze, and share with stakeholders. I do hope you had an opportunity to visit the new IPHC website. We migrated our old website to the new platform a couple of months ago, just in time for the annual meeting series and papers to go live. But as part of that, I do encourage you to really explore the website, particularly the data sets and the data interactives. The team has worked extremely hard to take all of the data that we collect on behalf of the Commission and broader stakeholder community and digest and present them in a way that you can all access. So if you are familiar or if you are interested in particular the data and research and monitoring that the Commission undertakes, there's a very good chance that those data sets are available on the website as stakeholder interactives. And you're going to have the opportunity tomorrow night when we have the poster presentation to not only hear about some of the updates of the research programs that are being undertaken, but also how accessible that data has become on the website. And that extends everything from the Fishery Independent Setline Survey, the bycatch associated with fishing for Pacific halibut, through to the water column profiler data, which is now all available on the website. Over the course of the next year or so, we will be developing a more data-friendly interactive for that water column profiler data. And again, I think that would be in alignment with the climate statement, which has just been adopted as well. The annual report is typically published within the first quarter of the calendar year. The 2022 report was published in March of 2023, and we are currently finalizing or developing and finalizing the 2023 report. And so that will go live by the end of March of this year. We continue to communicate to our stakeholders and commissioners in our two primary means, those being IPHC circulars, the more formal commission-orientated communication. All of those circulars are available on the website, and you can also sign up to receive those. And the same goes for the media releases. Media releases will cover everything from job announcements to potentially tenders for the Fishery Independent Setline Survey. So please do sign up for those if you want to keep in touch with the IPHC throughout the year. We have a very active external engagement among staff, everything from joining various committees and teams, broadly North America versus Canada and the US. Those are listed there with the staff who are associated with those teams or those committee meetings. And in addition, we maintain strong academic affiliations with a number of the universities. Dr. Hicks, for example, is affiliate faculty at the University of Washington, and as is Dr. Stewart, and Dr. Planas is affiliate faculty at Alaska Pacific University here in Anchorage. Those team members are also very active and have student committees that they mentor at various universities, and those are listed on the screen at the moment, and obviously they change from year to year. In terms of publications, 3 journal peer-reviewed publications from staff this year. We have another in peer review and another 3 which are currently undergoing review from particular journals. And so hopefully they'll be published in the first half of 2024. And so we're simply asking Chair for the Commission to note this paper, which includes the updates on activities that aren't covered in papers already before you. And I did just put a couple of images up there to also note that we have a very active community outreach program in the broader Seattle region. And the staff in particular are very keen to ensure that they're giving back to the community that we work in. And so I'll leave there. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, thank you for those updates. Commissioners, any questions? Seeing any. Okay, I think that brings us to item 3.3, an update on the performance review.
Thank you very much, Chair. So if I could just have the PowerPoint, please. Okay, thank you, Chair. So as you indicated, this is agenda item 3.3, paper 05, and it's the standard update we provide on the progress the Commission, the Secretariat, and other stakeholders who have responsibilities to complete these actions have undertaken over the past year. 2024 will be the last typical year of a performance review. They are typically adopted for a 5-year period. But just as we progress, just a reminder that the Commission has agreed to hold off on undertaking a new performance review for a 5-year period for the next couple of years. And the intention is simply to monitor the progress that we've made, the activities that we are still implementing, and on an annual basis, reconsider whether a third performance review is necessary and in what format that would take. As a broad brush summary or status of the implementation of the recommendations from that performance review, we have completed 18 of the 26 recommendations. There are 5 that are still in progress, 2 that are pending with contracting parties undertaking various updates to those 2 recommendations, and 1 of them are on hold. Now, we do go through these typically once a year at the work meeting for the Commission, and so it's not my intention to step through them in detail. But for those new in the room, just as an example, the recommendations are set up in such a way that the recommendation from the performance review is incorporated in the annex to that paper, as well as any updates that the Commission may have made since those recommendations were adopted, the priority, the responsibility, and delivery timeframe. And if there are any modifications that have been made specifically since those recommendations were adopted. And so, as I said, I don't intend on stepping through those in detail, but they are all provided in the paper for reference. And so I'll pause there, Chair, see if there are any questions.
Okay, any questions on that? Not seeing any, Dave.
Okay, thank you. Agenda item 3.4, 3.5, and 3.6 are all updates on the outcomes of the subsidiary bodies related to the science activities of the Commission in 2023. So we're going to very briefly hear from the MSAB co-chair, Dr. Holson, who's going to walk you through some of those key updates, or outcomes rather, from MSAB 18. So over to you, Pete.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Wilson. And through the chair, we convened, Mr. Adam Kaiser and myself, the 18th meeting of the MSAB last May. My opinion, was a fairly productive meeting. From that meeting, no recommendations resulted, but we had 9 requests. A notable event was that we found out that Adam's job responsibilities were going to draw him away from being able to be the co-chair anymore. So he will be stepping back at the next meeting. One of the first things that we'll do is to elect new co-chairs. My term will be up as well. Ms. Gwen Mason is with me today to stand in for Adam. She will be taking over some of these requests that we will now present. So the first request that we had some extensive discussion about was how to roll over members on the board, on the board, and basically how to raise people up in a manner that they could be productive and hit the ground running. So what we requested was that agency staff from the contracting parties would put together some text for you commissioners to review, to possibly amend to the rules of procedure. Then we requested that some materials would be developed in order to explain the relationship and how PDO and the environmental variables are used within the assessment model, either in a pamphlet or a poster. And I actually understand that there is a poster outside right now that the Secretariat has put together in order to try to satisfy this request about how the PDO is incorporated. Next, after a distribution procedure is agreed upon by the commission and Alan starts looking at multi-year assessments, we brought up several different concepts that could be looked at in evaluating the effectiveness of a multi-year assessment procedure. These include using the FIS to drive annual changes or having a constraint on this, either 10 to 15%. Perhaps there be some sort of a smoothing element, which could be a multi-year average or other techniques to do that in the distribution procedure. Could you scroll up? Thank you. And then also looking at various SBR rates. And then we also requested that a retrospective analysis be considered. So in between the intervening years of having an assessment run, you would need some sort of empirical rule, whether you follow the up or down of the FIS. And what we asked was that a retrospective analysis be done where you look through the past and see how closely the model mimics the change in the FIS, understanding that the assessment model itself integrates various other sources of information besides the FIS to see how much it or if there is a dampening effect and how that could be incorporated perhaps into a multi-year procedure. So I'll go ahead and step back and let Gwen take over from here.
Right. Thanks, Pete, and through the chair. For folks who don't know me, my name is Gwen Mason. I am the halibut coordinator with Fisheries and Oceans Canada, and I am certainly not Adam, but I will try my best. So I will go through and summarize the last 5 requests that were made at MSAB 18. So requests 5, 6, and 7 all relate to the primary MSE objectives and the associated performance metrics with them. So for request number 5, this is regarding objective A of the harvest strategy policy, which is to maintain the female stock spawning stock biomass above a limit reference point of B20 at least 95% of the time. So given that this is a risk metric that must be met, the MSAB had requested that the performance metric be reported as a pass or fail. And just as a note, since then and to date, the Secretariat has been reporting the results of this objective as such. Request number 6 was regarding objective B, which is maintaining the female spawning stock biomass at or above B36 at least 50% of the time. This is a priority objective that must be met in a single direction, i.e. it may be higher than B36. And the performance metric is a measure of the range and variability that must be met range and a variability in the relative spawning biomass. As such, MSAB had requested for the performance metric to be reported as a pass or fail, along with the associated numerical value with it. Request number 7 was that MSAB had requested new performance metrics representing the change in TCEY in non-assessment years, and the change in TCEY in assessment years be developed for the evaluation of multi-year assessment MPs. So now just shifting gears a little bit to the last 2 requests. These were a bit more logistical in nature. For request number 8, noting that some participants thought that a November MSAB informational session might be useful if the Secretariat thought that there were any important updates that MSAB should be made aware of prior to the interim meeting. So as such, at the meeting that took place this past May, MSAB requested that such a meeting be scheduled in November of 2023 if it was required. However, it was not required, so we didn't need to schedule one. And then lastly, for the last request, MSAB had requested that MSAB 19 be held in May 2024 rather than in October 2024. And this was as previously noted by the Commission. It was also requested that future MSAB meetings occur prior to the June SRB meeting in the same year. Thanks, guys. That's it for me. Happy to take some questions, but I probably can't answer them.
Okay, commissioners, any questions? All right, let's proceed. Yeah, thanks for the reminder. So Dave just reminded me, we do have at least a few existing slots on the MSAB where people have, in those slots, have changed roles or left their positions. So the commission will be identifying a process fairly near term to try to fill those roles. Just an informational piece. Thanks, Dave.
Thank you very much, Chair. So we'll now move on to the next agenda item, and it's an update on the outcomes of the reports of the Scientific Review Board. And we have the chair of the SRB, Dr. Sean Cox, here to present those two reports. Thank you. Over to you, Dr. Cox.
Thank you. And thank you for inviting me up here again. It's good to see everybody. So our Scientific Review Board has 4 members, and we meet twice a year, once in June, which that meeting is mainly focused on research topics, things that more of a broad-ranging discussion of things that could be done to improve some of the science and decision-making. And then another one in September where we focus more on the more immediate issues related to the stock assessment. The SRB underwent some changes this year. Dr. Kim Scribner, who you see with the nice full white beard there, is now retired. He's emeritus from the SRB. We really appreciate, the depth and, extent to which Kim was able to share his experience especially with the ecosystem sciences branch, and really raising the standard of that scientific group. We have Dr. Olaf Jensen from the University of Wisconsin, who's been a member now for a few years. And we have a new member, Dr. Anna Kuparainen. Now, if you're wondering how to pronounce her university affiliation, I asked ChatGPT, and it told me that it's Jyväskylä, the University of Jyväskylä. So I probably should check some references to that next time I see her and make sure I don't embarrass myself using ChatGPT. Okay, there's some action photos noting, recommending, and requesting, working up a sweat doing those things. So one of the first action items we had was to endorse the 2024 FIS design, which I don't have a graphic for you for that, but we had a lot of discussion. The SRB is asked to endorse the FIS kind of early on in the process, so that usually the one that we endorse is not necessarily the one that's done. And so we had a lot of discussion about the revenue neutrality constraint on the FIS. And so that brought up some other issues that I'll get to in a few minutes in our recommendations. One of the, I'm not going to go over every single recommendation and request that we had, just some of the ones that are more interesting and relevant to this meeting. So we did recommend that the operating model, which is used to guide the management strategy evaluation, that be reconditioned every 3rd year after the stock assessment is done. Just to keep it up to date. One of the main topics we talked about was exceptional circumstances. And this is a situation where if you ultimately do adopt a formal management procedure, you want to be comfortable that the advice that the procedure is giving you is consistent with all the data and understanding that's behind it. And it could be that in a particular situation, something looks weird. And I have an example here for you. For example, you might want to get concerned if a estimate from the FIS comes out well outside the range of what it was expected to be. So I thank Alan for giving me this figure to demonstrate this. Here's an example where you have a number of years where you have a projection. So this would be the management strategy evaluation projecting out what the FIS would be over a number of years. And you can see those are the gray boxes there. So obviously it's a projection. So it's a range of possibilities. And what you want to do is make sure that the actual FIS that's coming in stays within that range. So you can see here, the orange dot inside those boxes would be the actual space-time model output. And then at the end is a year that's coming. And if it lands inside the distribution, you would assume that your management procedure is still operating within its design considerations. And then there's another one that if it had fallen wells, let's say outside that range, then it could possibly represent a trigger event of an exceptional circumstance. And so we have some specifics on that coming up in a minute. I'll show you some examples. A key thing about this is that it could be just a one-off. You know, the next year it could go right back in that confidence interval. So it should be clearly something that's unusual. So there may be other things that are going on as well. And so basically to establish that an exceptional circumstance is not unusual, it's something that you need to have a fairly high threshold for triggering it. Otherwise, you're triggering it all the time, and that kind of is no longer exceptional. So one of the things that an exceptional circumstance could do, if possibly triggered, would be a presentation at the next SRB meeting, so we can get more eyes on the situation and see what is possibly going on. I'm going to get back to this in a minute, but I'm just kind of following the order of the recommendations from the particular meetings. And this one was related to basically we're recommending more work be done on the seasonal distribution of, rather the seasonal reproductive cycles of halibut. The seasonal reproductive cycle helps to define the maturity schedule, and the maturity schedule helps to define what the spawning stock biomass is. And so there's been some promising work that's been done by the Ecosystem Sciences group on how maturity progresses in female halibut throughout the year, but it was done in a particular location. So we'd like to see that done more broadly so that that information can be integrated over the entire spawning stock. Now, as I mentioned, there are issues with the FIS and the revenue neutrality, and that sometimes leads to reduced designs. There is a possibility that it may not be feasible to do a FIS at a particular time. So one of the things we're recommending is that the MSE fairly soon start looking at scenarios where the FIS is not done, either at some random interval or just pick a year where it's not done, and see what the impact might be on performance. The idea being that not being able to complete the FIS should not represent an exceptional circumstance, because there are lots of situations in other fisheries where a survey doesn't get done and the thing just trucks along. So ideally, that's what you would want, something that can absorb a situation like that and not have it become a crisis. This one makes that specific request. Another topic we got into was the whale depredation. Dr. Stewart's been working on that fairly diligently, and a lot of other people in the group. And so this is a request from June that we asked for more information, particularly from the U.S. Observer data on whale depredation, and I'll get to the results of that from our September meeting in a little bit. And so getting to our September meeting, we did see some encouraging results using AI to improve the efficiency of aging. And so we're not just jumping on the AI bandwagon. It's definitely something that could improve the aging program and the aging results and make it more efficient. So we recommended more of that. And yeah, we recommended not using whale depredation in the stock assessment. I know that it could be, something that may be sensitive in certain areas, but overall, it doesn't seem to have a major impact on the stock assessment for the amount of effort that it takes to work on. So we recommended it not be included. This particular one, we recommended to develop some objectives related to maintaining spawning biomass among, certain levels of spawning biomass in each region. The reason for this was so that this, you obviously want to keep the spawning biomass distribution somewhat in a normal state. And using using relative spawning distribution doesn't quite achieve that to the same effect as if you're using absolute. So we recommended developing some biomass objectives in the regions. Another topic that came up was the long-term target for coastwide female spawning biomass. This is the B36%, which is the current target. One of the issues that this involves is if, and as far as I know, in some of our discussion was that if people are somewhat unhappy about catch rates of halibut right now, the stock is above B36. So if the stock is going to get smaller, the catch rates would get worse by definition. So it might be a good idea to at least have some discussion about target biomasses that have more of a practical implication. So if you have, for example, target catch rates that are either whether it's WPUE in the FIS or whether it's commercial catch rates, that would be probably a better way to develop biomass objectives than some arbitrary, theoretical value of B36. Now back to exceptional circumstances. I gave you the example of one possible criterion, which is the space-time model coming outside the expected distribution. That's one possibility. It could also involve things like stock distribution. So you could look at it by region that way. Also, there are a lot of other things that have to do with the stock, like, sorry, it's grayed out here, so I didn't talk about it, but here I am talking about it. Things to do with recruitment, weighted age, sex ratios. There's a lot of biological information in the stock assessment that you also want to keep a track of. And if something goes haywire, you might want to react to it. Oops. Yeah, so this is following up on what might happen if an exceptional circumstance would be declared, and wanting to have a formal set of steps to go through in that situation. So the first would be, for example, a review of the MSA simulations to see if the operating model, if it's a glitch in the original operating model, it could have been, and whether the management procedure should be reevaluated and updated that way. Oops, sorry, moving forward. If, and as was mentioned in the last presentation, if there was a multi-year management procedure where you had determined the TCEY, let's say for the next 3 years, and an exceptional circumstance is declared in that span, and there's no stock assessment available, then one thing you could do is trigger a stock assessment at the soonest possible time that you could do it. And then also consult with both the SRB, the MSAB to decide why it had occurred and what can possibly be done about it, and whether to maybe adjust the management procedure, abandon it, let it keep going, whatever it is, have some kind of response that way. And then, so it would probably be, if you triggered an exceptional circumstance in a given year, it might be another year or even 2 before something actually is done about it. This particular one, recommending that the management strategy evaluation look at fishing intensity and frequency of stock assessments. Those are the 2 main axes that we can see are important at the moment, along with the FIS, looking at FIS uncertainty scenarios there. We also recommended that the commission consider revising the harvest policy explicitly to first determine the coastwide TCEY using a formal management procedure. One of the obstacles that I think we're all aware of to adopting a management procedure is distribution. And it could be very simply dealt with by letting the management procedure determine the TCEY and then negotiate distribution. If you want to do that at the annual meeting, that's probably fine. Renegotiate the distribution from year to year, fix it for a number of years, whatever it is. Just separate those 2 things so that a formal management procedure can be adopted fairly soon. There are examples where the distribution is changed year to year without having a huge effect, at least on the stock, on the biology. There was one recommendation here about a lot of the work that's done in the management strategy evaluation relies on a concept in fisheries called compensation, which is that as the stock declines, it becomes more productive. That has to be true. Otherwise, we wouldn't have fisheries anywhere in the world. And it is generally true. There's not very much evidence that it's not true, but there are a few cases where it is not true, and where some stocks, when they get really, really small, that's when their productivity collapses and then the thing disappears. We're not saying this is the case for halibut, but that it should maybe be included as a stress test in the MSE. There were a lot more than this one recommendation and request of the biological program, but this is one of the more substantive ones, and that's the program is using genomic data more and more, genetic data, and it would be a good idea to establish some long-term objectives for what to do with that, because some of it involves, if you're looking to use it over a long time period, it would be good to start proper sampling now, and that would involve a much broader group. It would involve fishermen more and a lot of other collaborators. Yeah, so this is what I was mentioning earlier about the FIS, and that is, it would be good to have some idea of the cost estimates presented along with the FIS design, so we can have at least some idea of what we're likely to see happen, come from what we endorse. In the short term, it's probably not a huge deal to reduce the FIS design, just because of the precision of the current survey and the way the model integrates over time. Those effects are not going to be drastic. If anything, it would affect the stock distribution. In the longer term, like I said earlier, it would be a good idea to consider some scenarios for the FIS. If you had higher CVs, for example. So right now, one of the big constraints is that the FIS is constrained to be fairly precise. There's a lot of sampling that needs to be done. And the question is whether you could live with fewer, if you take fewer samples, you get a broader distribution of possible outcomes. So the result from that is a bit more predictable in the long term. You would have more variability in your biomass estimates. So that's one thing. And that variability in biomass estimates would lead to variability in TCEY. Variability in biomass estimates might also influence the harvest policy decisions, and that might also add variability to the regional distribution of that TCEY or the TCEY itself. So those kinds of things should be included in the MSE projections. Oh, and there we go. And I'll take any questions.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Cox. Neil?
Thanks, Dr. Cox. I had a couple questions. My first question was about exceptional circumstances. I mean, I'm struck by, there's quite a few recommendations on that topic. And I wondered what brought the SRB around to spending what seems like a fair amount of time on that topic? Were there some driving factors?
Yeah, well, experience is one of members of the SRB. I mean, one of the reasons for exceptional circumstances is to establish the conditions that someone can argue that the management procedure isn't working. So if you adopt a management procedure and someone doesn't like it, then they could say, well, the survey isn't right. there's something wrong with the survey and I won't accept the outcome. The idea behind exceptional circumstances is to define the conditions where someone could legitimately say that and challenge the output from a management procedure. And then you would have a process, a scientific process to follow with that. So that's the general experience of the SRB. Another reason is, I forget which review it was, but it was Trevor Branch who recommended that you do that. So we're following those. That became one of our, I guess, one of the requests of the SRB to look into that.
Okay, thank you. The other question I had was about the slide on AI, and I should remember this, but I don't. I think we had asked for some thinking to be done around where we might make use of AI, and I wondered, the SRB, was that a discussion about, I think it was, you had said there was some room for making use of that. Was it with age data? I can't remember what.
It was in the aging, yeah.
But I wondered, did the SRB discuss more broadly where there may be opportunities for us to leverage AI technology, or did it only come up in the context of age data? It just seems like there may be, I'm interested in your views on whether there is scope for the SRB to be part of a discussion around where the commission and the Secretariat staff might be able to leverage that technology.
Yeah, it's a broad topic. It wasn't a specific agenda item for us to discuss in general. It came up related to aging. It'd probably be good to put it on our agenda for maybe the research meeting. I mean, AI can do lots of things. It can write computer code if you give it a good thing to do and you're willing to fix its errors, but it would be something to sit down and think about. One of the reasons it's good for aging is that there's a lot of data there. There's a lot of information contained in the age, there's 100 years of ages to read. There's thousands and thousands of samples. It's a very intense human process where if you can automate it, so it's a great place to start, and it's kind of where you do have that. I've seen other projects. I think it's Northern Shrimp on the East Coast in Canada. I was thinking it was halibut, but it's not. But they're trying to use AI for their survey, and it's not going well. I mean, just because that survey doesn't have a lot of information in it. It's a shrimp. It's all over the place. So there's a trade-off, right? There has to be information there for you to extract, and aging is the low-hanging fruit there.
Okay, thank you.
Dr. Cox, I had a question for you. Early in your presentation, you made the observation that the SRB tends to be called upon to evaluate FIS designs fairly early in the process, and then we may make changes. Unless I missed it, I don't think you were specifically highlighting a recommendation to change the process on that, but I'm wondering if the SRB has discussed that at all. The commission lately has had some pretty robust discussions around what to do in FIS design, given the fact that the survey has had trouble making ends meet and not wanting to be overly motivated by the revenue neutrality principle and wanting to make sure that we have the kind of coverage that is needed. But anyway, has the SRB discussed that and any recommended changes?
Well, our main concern is that, like I said in one of my slides there, whether it's a reduced design or a full design right now doesn't represent a huge risk for the stock assessment and that kind of thing. Our concern is that if the stock is getting smaller and smaller, if it does get very small to the point where you may have to skip multiple surveys, then the uncertainty in the survey goes in the wrong direction, right? The smaller the stock is getting, the more uncertain you are. which is what we were concerned about. And so that, I think we did have a recommendation in there that we at least see some costing of the different FIS designs, so we can at least get an idea of where the most revenue neutral ones are, and discuss it around there.
But in terms of timing, though, I guess I'm not hearing that the SRB was specifically asking for an opportunity to weigh in on modifications that the commission is contemplating. And you know, that may be difficult because we're doing it kind of late in the process.
Yeah. And it may be something that we just, qualitatively look at it qualitatively, that, let's see some really reduced options and some intermediate ones, rather than something that is almost surely not going to be done.
Yeah. Understood. Thank you. Paul?
Yeah, thanks, John. Sean, I think it was slide 34 where you were referencing the short-term risk implications and that you were just speaking about, and with the FIS designs. And so I guess I want to make sure that I'm not misinterpreting what you have on that slide. I mean, when I read that, it sounds like you're not particularly concerned with missing some areas, given where the status of the stock is currently. But I guess, how would you take into account addition of cost estimates that would help inform us what the implications are for risk?
I think we were thinking more long-term in that case. I think the main issue is that, we're looking at designs that are likely to be done and not ones that are probably not going to be done, since we're endorsing it. Otherwise, why ask us to endorse something that is not likely to happen? This particular issue around short-term risk, I'm not sure if that's more what you're getting at. I mean, in the short term, you have the space-time model, which is it's a smoother. So it's accounting for what happened last year, what happened in the neighboring areas that have been sampled. So it's kind of smoothing things over in that year-to-year effect. But if it's doing it wrong, those things will multiply over the longer term, and that's where the risk is happening. Probably not a great answer. You don't look convinced.
Well, not totally, and maybe we can talk about it some more, because the way I read it right now, it sounds like in the short term you're not concerned, but if we carried on with a much reduced FIS design, then the risk goes up.
Exactly.
So given what we're struggling with right now, I would say, probably more driven by financial concerns in the short term. What I read in that slide is, don't get too hung up on it, but the long term certainly expands the risks significantly is the way I read it.
And it ties into the one, I don't know which other one it was, but it was the one that I was talking about, considering whether this B36 is a good target. Because the B36 is really, it's a biological theoretical concept. It doesn't consider revenue neutrality of the survey or anything.
I appreciate the back and forth on that, and I will say this is something I have struggled with in that we look at recommended FIS designs for 2-3 years out, and it's fine to say, that's our intention. Great, we're going to do this particular design, but without having a revenue model that can fund that type of survey to make it either cost neutral or having additional revenue sources, it may not be realistic. And so I guess it's just an area of caution for us in not being too cavalier about these short-term decisions when we don't have confidence in what the out years will bring and what we'll be able to get done. Peter, did I see your hand?
Well, just to finish that on that topic, kind of to our surprise, and I'm not sure we wrote it in the document, but we should have anyway. But the staff, Ian, walked us through the calculations that are done to calculate the revenue coming from the survey, and it's a great piece of work. As far as practical modeling goes, it's a hugely valuable tool that when we saw that, we were like, this is exactly what we would have said, to do. And we really appreciated getting a walkthrough of that, so we can really get an understanding of, when they're coming up with revenue projections and dealing with this neutrality issue, it's based on a lot of good information and analysis.
Good, thanks. Peter?
Yeah, thank you very much for that back and forth on FIS. It's, lots of fishermen, there's two main concerns they bring up, and it's the FIS and whale depredation a lot. And so I just wanted to speak to your recommendation of not including it in stock assessments, and the results that it only had small changes in TCEY. I know some of the logbook data may not be all there, and that can be a challenge. But also, how does the rate of whales depredating, if it's an increasing rate, if it's an increasing pattern, it's an increasing trend you see over time, how would that affect whale depredation and stock assessment in the model?
Yeah. Oh, well, the more kind of when whales are eating fish off the lines, it means there's fish there. So accounting for whale depredation is kind of offset because you have to inflate the biomass to account for all that. So that's why the effect kind of comes out in the wash. It's not a hugely impactful effect in the assessment anyway. It could get larger if it goes up fairly quickly. You could end up with kind of something that looks like natural mortality, I guess. Could look like a change in natural mortality, and that would lead to a decrease in the productivity of the stock, but it'd have to be really large, I think, to have an impact on it. But it's certainly something you could ask your MSE team to look at in a scenario. I don't want to speculate on what the result would be, but it's definitely something that can be calculated.
Okay, yeah. And some of the rate changes I've heard of are quite large, when new whales get introduced to this and they suddenly it wasn't a problem, and then all of a sudden it's a large problem, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so that's the concern that I'm hearing from folks, both mostly in BC, but in Alaska as well. And I have talked to Dr. Hicks about that before. So.
Good. Yeah, I'm sure he's got it already programmed in there.
Bob?
Dr. Cox, I'm not sure which slide it was, but you made a comment on genomic information, and the note I wrote down is what to do with it. So I was wondering if the SRB had something more specific on that issue.
Well, the holy grail in stock assessment is to not have to use a model and just be able to calculate what your biomass is. And there are a couple of fisheries that have started using genetic methods to do that. One of them, it's called close kin market capture. I think I've mentioned it in earlier meetings, but that would, and the Atlantic halibut fishery in Canada has a research program working on doing that. A fishery that I work with, the southern bluefin tuna, does that. They've got they can reconstruct the abundance of that stock going back several decades based on genetic parent offspring pairs. They can get parent offspring pairs, they can find brothers and sisters, and from that information you can figure out how many spawners there are to produce that. So that's the kind of the holy grail right now in using genomic data for fisheries stock assessment. Other methods, in part of it, you can also use genomics to age fish as well. And that's one of the applications that, again, I'm really fortunate that I'm on a panel for southern bluefin tuna, because they're doing about everything that is at the cutting edge of just about everything. So that's where they use AI, for example. They take genomic data. Maybe you guys are familiar with this stuff, but you can age things now based on the tips of the DNA particles. You can determine, it's called epigenetic aging. And so in that case, you don't need a hard structure. You don't need to go through all the effort of pulling out otoliths. You just take a tissue sample and run it through a DNA analysis and use a heck of a lot of AI, because there's so much information contained in that DNA that they get very, very precise age estimates from that as well. So that's two areas that you could apply genomics to. Maybe I can look into this is CSIRO in Australia that funds most of this work, so it's not cheap to do. But I could certainly look into it as to what those or your group could look into. And I know they are. I know Josep is already, he's looking into these things as well. So
Thank you.
Okay, anything else for Dr. Cox?
should have brought a glass of water.
Yeah, perhaps a glass of water. Thank you very
All right,
much.
thanks.
That brings us on to the Research Advisory Board.
Yeah, thank you very much, Chair. So if we could have the report for the RAB up on the screen, please. And just while that's occurring, yes, I'll just support that last comment. And Dr. Planas does have a research project underway. It's in its initial stages, and you're going to hear a little bit from him later about looking at genomics and the possibilities for aging fish as well. So the report of the Research Advisory Board, the 24th session, the board met immediately prior to the interim meeting last November. I would just make a general call at this point, and it's probably not the right meeting given that many of our Canadian colleagues have not been able to come to Anchorage due to some of the flight cancellations. But at present, we're somewhat deficient with our Canadian representation on the RAB. And so on the screen, you can see the RAB membership includes two Canadian representatives. And so if you are in the room and you are interested in joining the RAB, particularly if you're a Canadian representative, please do approach myself or Dr. Planas throughout the course of the meeting, and we can have a chat and see if you'd be willing to step onto the board and come to Seattle once a year to discuss the various research projects and make recommendations to the Commission. We'd certainly appreciate that. In terms of the recommendations from the RAB, there were 6 recommendations and 3 requests. And I'm just going to step through these relatively briefly for most of them, because they're key topics that I think have been covered both by the SRB and also the MSAB. And I'll pause and discuss a few of those that received more attention throughout the Research Advisory Board meeting itself. The first is again on this topic of AI technologies and techniques, and Dr. Hutchinson presented some of the AI work that herself and her team are initiating with fish otoliths, and the RAB was equally as supportive of continuing with the research project to see what could possibly be potential for the IPHC in terms of fish aging for Pacific halibut. As you're aware, we age some 10,000 fish every year manually through age readers, and the opportunity for introducing AI, whether it's a validation or whether it becomes a principle into the future, there's a lot of scope for that. And the RAB also acknowledged and supported that approach. Whale depredation, again, went through the SRB, but also through the RAB, and the RAB was very keen to see the Secretariat continue to undertake studies to identify and test new tools to minimize marine mammal depredation. And so the RAB recommended that we continue our efforts towards that goal. We have had discussions at the commission level about funding for those types of projects, and there is a general agreement that at this point, that wherever possible, the Secretariat will be seeking external funds for those types of mitigation measures. There was a very robust discussion around the Fishery Independence Setline Survey. No surprises in terms of how that discussion went, but the concluding remark, I guess, from the RAB was that Secretariat that it was clear that we would need to continue to source or seek supplementary funding for the Fishery Independence Setline Survey. And again, for the same reasons that the Chair, Dr. Cox, has just covered from the SRB's comments surrounding if the biomass is low, the revenue is low coming in, it means that it's going to be continually shrinking. And so we need to seek supplementary funding to undertake setline survey activities in areas that are heavily revenue negative. The RAB was also presented with the potential design that was coming up for discussion at the commission meeting that you'll hear from Dr. Webster shortly. And as part of that, the RAB was very keen to see the oceanographic sampling program to continue. We did discuss the costs of undertaking that water profiler program coast-wide. We have about $100,000, we'll say, each year, depending on how many charter regions are sampled. But given the potential utility of that information being collected on each of our setline survey stations coast-wide, the RAB was very supportive of us continuing that, whether it be through government funding, contracting party funding, or seeking supplementary funding. And we have started that process already of trying to see if there are opportunities for end users of that data who might be interested in providing some supplementary funding. Very early at this stage, but as an example, we have the University of Oregon who are very heavy users of the data, and we are going to continue to approach them and others to see if there is some kind of user pay system that we could come up with. Early stages. In terms of guidance on some of the potential applied research projects, the RAB was also very keen to see us seek supplementary funding to support other activities, not only on whale depredation, but also other fishing gear technology advances. And so it's more of an aspirational recommendation, but again, it's something that we will build into our program of work. And as we come up with additional avenues for undertaking this type of technological research on fishing gears, we'll be seeking external funding, so not only relying on funds from contracting parties. There were 3 requests from the RAB for this year. The first being more of an informational request. It was raised that there was concern, particularly in Alaskan state waters, that the issue of bycatch being caught in those waters was leading to potential closures, or actual closures rather, of particular areas to longline fishing gear by ADFG. The Secretariat didn't have any information of substance at that point, and so the RAB simply requested that we undertake a sort of investigation and collaboration with ADF&G to see what these potential implications are and what the plan is, and then to share those outcomes with the RAB intersessionally. So I don't have any information on that at this point, but if our ADF&G representatives in the room would like to meet with RAB members, myself and Dr. Planas throughout the course of this meeting, that would certainly be a good point to initiate, and we'll then be able to provide that feedback to the RAB at the next meeting and also intersessionally. And then finally, or no, that's not finally, is it? I'm looking at 2 different screens trying to navigate. In terms of our monitoring activities, and in particular the fishery-dependent data that we undertake, the RAB noted the ongoing discussions and activities that we've been undertaking regarding e-logbooks, which are being developed for the fleet in Alaska. There was certainly a lot of discussion and hesitation from some RAB members about potential implications in data security and privacy. We do have, in terms of an update, we do have Lang Solberg from Deckhand, who has a station outside near the registration area and is also going to be joining us for the function this evening and is around tomorrow. And he's here to answer questions particularly related to some of these concerns. Not all of it, because a lot of the back end is involving the Secretariat and our databases and how we're going to be handling that information. But we feel that it's certainly useful to have Lang here, and I do encourage you to reach out. He's going to join the conference board for a presentation when the fishery regulations are presented, because it does relate to one of the proposals that's being put forward. And then finally, in terms of the specific 2024 design, the RAB had some concerns about some of the modifications that were being put forward. But more importantly, they were concerned about some of the fish prices that we were receiving in 2023 from the survey. And so they requested that we undertake an analysis of the fish prices that the commercial sector was receiving directly versus what we were receiving from our fish sales in the Fishery Independent Setline Survey. Dr. Hutchinson-Zach has already undertaken some preliminary investigation of that. And while there is, in some cases, some minor differences in the price that the survey is receiving versus what the commercial sector is receiving, there was no clear pattern. But that data is going to be looked into a little bit more. And I'm sure Dr. Hutchinson-Zach's available to answer more of those questions. As part of the recommendation, we will prepare something a little bit more substantive for the RAB to have a look at as well for broad information. And with that, Chair, that's it.
Okay, thank you, Dave. Commissioners, any questions about the RAB report? Peter.
Yeah, thank you. It was in regards to, sorry, just writing it down. Recommendation number 4. And has the commission developed how to carefully account for, like skipper sets, and how to distinguish that from sets that are, on the set line survey, and how they would integrate that data together? Have you developed anything?
Yeah, thank you for the question. Rather than myself stumbling through that, I can either pass to Dr. Stewart or Dr. Webster, or we can take that on notice if that's okay. And when they present very shortly, they can walk you through those potential implications. Do you have a preference of which one you'd like? Would you like to hear from them directly now? Okay. So if Dr. Stewart, Dr. Webster, you can just take that question on notice and respond when you present very shortly.
Okay, anything else related to the RAB? Okay, if not, that brings us to the 5-year program of integrated research and monitoring.
Thank you, Chair, and this will be the last you'll hear from me for a while. So this is just a very quick update for the 5-year program of integrated research and monitoring. And I'm going to present it briefly with Dr. Hutchinson-Zach. If I can, the team could just expand that because it's hard to do that from up here. So just a quick refresher in terms of the IPHC's 5-year program of integrated research and monitoring. It's running from 2022 to 26, but the Commission has requested us, and we've also indicated that it's going to be a living document. It's something that we're updating on an annual basis based on recommendations from the Scientific Review Board, the Research Advisory Board, and of course the Commission itself. And so we're going through and presenting this plan update to the Commission annually, and just highlighting any of those changes or tweaks that have been made. We have already been through 2 years of implementation review and updating, and this just some background information there that, as I said, it's really meant to be a living document, and that each year the SRB may choose to make specific recommendations and modifications to the Commission about the plan. For 2023, there are 3 core areas that have been updated. The first being the list of ongoing and planned research projects, and this is provided as Appendix 5 of the plan. Unfortunately, as we've built that that appendix out. It's become very clear that it's too unwieldy to incorporate into the plan document itself, because it does highlight not only the various projects that we're undertaking or being proposed, but also the milestones, deliverables, and impacts of each of those projects. And now we have the new website up and running. It's our intention over the coming months is that we'll be building another user interface on the website that's going to link to the 5-year plan and provide all of that information, and which will also allow us to provide extended information and recording on the core outcomes and deliverables, whether it be through scientific publications or modifications to our other work activities. There has also been a number of very minor updates throughout that we're not flagging at this point. But the third component, which Dr. Hutchinson is going to talk about, is specifically the age composition data introductions and also AI. So I'll pass to you, Basha.
Thank you, Dr. Wilson. So as it was mentioned, as a part of an update, we added the section on the use of AI for aging. In detail, the IPHC Secretariat is looking into options for supplementing the current Pacific Halibut aging protocol with automatized aging that does not require extensive otolith reader training. As a part of it, we are investigating the potential use of artificial intelligence for determining the age of Pacific Halibut from images of otoliths that were collected. For a little bit of a background, to date, IPHC aged over 1.5 million of otoliths. This gives us a great resource that can be used in creating a database of pictures with expert-provided labels for aging use. Taking pictures on top of that can be also incorporated into the current aging process at relatively minor time added. What we are looking into is an application of a convolutional neural network model, which is a type of deep learning application with an initial modeling framework adapted from a project Deep Otolith that has been previously applied to other species. This trial is intended to determine whether the approach offers accuracy of aging that would be suitable for IPHC products such as stock assessment. It is also important to note that AI is also evolving currently very rapidly, and adapting to new developments in this area may improve results over time. So the accuracy of the results from this project might be a function of not only the output in the form or training input in the form of pictures of the otoliths that we have aged, but also the improvements and progress in the realm of AI overall. But at the same time, utilizing automated aging will continue to rely on trained readers for training the model with inputs that capture temporal changes, at least to some degree. This might be particularly important because we would want to make sure that we capture things that are related to changing environmental conditions and climate change. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Basha. And so with that, Chair, that's the end of the presentation, and we can take questions.
Okay, thank you. Any questions? Not seeing it.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. Stay there, Basha, because I believe you're presenting the next agenda item, which is on fishery monitoring. So we've moved on to agenda item 4, and within fishery monitoring, we're going to have two presentations, one on fishery dependent data, and then the second on fishery independent data, and in particular, the setline survey that was undertaken in 2023. So we could have the presentation for paper 07, Rev 1, please. And then over to you, Basha.
Thank you. So this is a presentation on the fishery-dependent data and the summary for 2023. So the purpose of this presentation is to provide an overview of the 2023 Pacific halibut removals, including the status of mortality reported against fishery limits adopted by the Commission and outlined in the IPHC fishery regulations. These data provided here in this presentation includes current and projected values as of 5th January 2024. As a reminder, the IPHC also produces a regular updates on the 1st and 15th of each month during the Pacific Halibut Open, when the Pacific Halibut fishery is open, and these updates are available on our website. Overall, the total mortality in 2023 is estimated at 14,969 tons, or 33 million pounds, which represents 89% of the coastwide total constant exploitation yield, or TCEY. I'll now step region by region to provide more detailed statistics and summaries. For IPHC Regulatory Area 2A, for the non-treaty directed commercial fishery, the fishery limit was 117 tons, or 260,000 pounds. This fishery was conducted through 3 58-hour-long fishing periods in June, July, and August, and the mortality was slightly above the limit at 118 tons, or 260,000 pounds. This is slightly more than the fishery was in the previous year, when it reached 96% of the fishery limit. The Treaty Indian directed commercial fishery had a limit of 228 tons, or 500,000 pounds. This fishery was conducted through a combination of restricted and unrestricted openers that varied by tribe. The fishery reached very close to the limit. It was at 99%, and harvested 225 tons, or 500,000, or when rounded, 500,000 pounds. It's very close where the fishery was in the year before, at about 100% of the limit. For the incidental commercial landings with salmon troll fishery in IPHC Regulatory Area 2A, the fishery limit was 21 tons, or 50,000 pounds. This fishery was open between 1st of April and 31st of October in Washington and Oregon, and was operating under management measures of 1 Pacific halibut per each 2 Chinook, plus 1 additional fish with maximum of 35 fish per trip. There was 1 in-season action when the retention was extended past 30th of June. The mortality in this fishery was at 53% of the fishery limit, at 11 tons, or 20,000 pounds. This was slightly below where the fishery was last year, the year before, at 61%. For the incidental commercial landings with sablefish fishery, the limit was 32 tons, or 70,000 pounds. This fishery was opened between 1st of April to 7th of December, and operated with a management measure of 150 pounds of Pacific halibut for every 1,000 pounds of sablefish, plus 2 additional fish. There were no in-season actions for this fishery. The fishery mortality was 21 tons, or 50,000 pounds, which represents 65% of the fishery limit, which is substantially less in terms of percentage in comparison to the year before, when the fishery reached 122% of the fishery limit. For the IPHC Regulatory Area 2B, the commercial fishery is a quota share fishery that operates throughout the commercial fishing period. That was last year, 10th of March to 7th of December. The fishery had a limit of 2,282 tons, or a little over 5 million pounds. And the fishery landed 98% of the fishery limit. That was 2,233 tons, or 4.92 million pounds. This is just a little over where the fishery was the year before, at 96% of the fishery limit. For IPHC regulatory areas 2C to 4, representing Alaska, the directed commercial fishery is also a quota share fishery that operated throughout the whole commercial fishing period. The fishery limit was 8,614 tons, or just a little under 19 million pounds. The fishery landed 7,064 tons, or 15.57 million pounds, and that represents 82% of the fishery limit, just slightly below where the fishery was the year before, at 85% of the limit. In IPHC Regulatory Area 2C, there is also a net island reserve fishery that has no limit. This fishery landed 17 tons, or 40,000 pounds, and operated with 12 two-day openings between 14th of April and 17th of September. The two plots here represent cumulative attainment of fishery limits by directed commercial fishery in all regions. And as you can see, in terms of percentage, the line very closely traced the line from previous year. But in terms of the weight, the fishery is much closer, looking much more like a fishery in 2020, below where the fishery was in 2022 or 2021. For the recreational fisheries, for IPHC Regulatory Area 2A, the fishery had a limit of 279 tons or 610,000 pounds. This fishery was open on starting 1st of April, and overall mortality was 240 tons or a little over 500,000 pounds. This represents 86% of the fishery limit, which is a little above where the fishery was the year before at 76%. The recreational fishing in California closed on 4th of August with 17 tons or 40,000 pounds, representing 97% of the fishery limit. In Oregon, the fishery closed on 31st of October with 104 tons or 230,000 pounds. That represents 78% of the fishery limit. And in Washington, closed on 30th of September with 118 tons or 260,000 pounds, which represents 93% of the fishery limit. For IPHC Regulatory Area 2B, recreational fishery, the fishery had a limit of 404 tons or 890,000 pounds. This fishery was conducted between 1st of February to 30th of September, when the fishery was closed for early closure notice. The mortality was about at the fishery limit, slightly more than the year before when the fishery season finished at 92% of the fishery limit. Recreational fishery can be also conducted using experimental recreational quota in British Columbia. And through this XRQ program, removals were at 7 tons or 20,000 pounds, about 2 tons more than in the year before. For recreational fisheries in IPHC regulatory areas 2C to 4, that is areas in Alaska, the projected limit and the projection for both guided and unguided sectors in total was 2,291 tons, or a little above 5 million pounds. Overall, the limit was the fishery took 90% of that limit projection, or 2,064 tons, or 4.55 million pounds. This is pretty much exactly where the fishery was in the year before. Specifically for the charter sector that occurs in IPHC regulatory, for the sectors in IPHC regulatory areas 2C and 3A, the fishery this charter sector fishery had a limit of 1,220 tons, or 2.69 million pounds, and this fishery took 88% of the fishery limit. That is 1,074 tons, or 2.37 million pounds. This is very close to where the fishery was as well in the year before. The next slide is on the subsistence fisheries. This fishery is conducted year-round, and the estimated removals for last year are 380 tons, or 840,000 pounds. This is slightly below the estimate for 2022, when the removals were at 435 tons, or 960,000 pounds. The estimates by areas are as follows. For the area 2A, it was 13 tons or 30,000 pounds. For British Columbia, it was 184 tons or 400,000 pounds. And for Alaska, it was 182 tons or 400,000 pounds. For the non-directed commercial discard mortality, this is also occurring year-round. The estimated removals were at 1,971 tons, or 4.35 million pounds. This is slightly below the estimate for 2022, when the removals were at 2,297 tons or 5.06 million pounds. In the by area, for area 2A, it was 36 tons or 80,000 pounds. For British Columbia, it was 182 tons or 400,000 pounds. And for Alaska, it was 1,753 tons or 3.87 million pounds. The table here summarized the mortality estimates reported against mortality limits by IPHC regulatory areas, and then it compares it with the year before. As we can see, the attainment of the limit varies between IPHC regulatory areas, and it stands at between 41% for area 4B to 102% for area 2B. Overall, the attainment of the limit was at 89%, and when adding non-directed commercial discard mortality under 26, it's 90%. The next table shows the mortality against the limits by sector, and this was between 86% for the directed commercial to 91% for the recreational sector. So as a conclusion, the recommendation is that the Commission notes the paper that provides the Commission with an overview of the Pacific halibut removals, including the status of mortality reported against fishery limits adopted by the Commission and outlined in the regulations. I would also like to take this opportunity to highlight information paper 3, which provides the Commission, as well as all the stakeholders, with an overview of steps taken to improve the overall quality and usability of publicly available IPHC data products. And all of these are available on our new website in a much more usable and user-friendly format. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Basha. Any questions on fishery-dependent data? Doesn't look like it.
Thank you.
Oh, let's go do that. Yeah, so I think rather than break here, we'll go ahead and cover the fishery independent data. Thank you, Kayla. And then we'll take a break right after this.
Okay, thank you, Commissioners. There we go. All right, the Fishery Independent Setline Survey's primary objective is for standardized fishery independent data collection for the Pacific halibut stock assessment and stock distribution estimation. The survey allows for the look at Pacific halibut distribution and abundance trends through the collection of biological data such as the sex, maturity, and age of Pacific halibut. For the 2023 FIS, our standardized gear was both fixed and snap gear for the first time. Both gear types were open for bidding coast-wide for the 2023 survey. Each skate is to meet the same following specifications as it has been over the past number of years at 1,800 feet with 100 hooks separated with 18 feet apart, and number 3 circle hooks threaded through the front on 24 to 48 inches or 61 to 122 centimeter ganyons. And 7 to 10 pound or 3 to 5 kilogram weights are placed on each non-anchored skate end. The standard bait for the Fishery Independent Setline Survey is frozen chum salmon that is number 2 semi-bright or better. This salmon is cut at 1/4 to 1/3 of a pound or 1/10 to 1/6 of a kilogram. And both the Fishery Independent Setline Survey vessel captains and the Secretariat on board work together to ensure that all bait meets IPHC standards, and captains are asked to sign off on bait quality. This shows the map for the planned 2023 Fishery Independent Set Line Survey. This season ran from the 26th of May to the 1st of September, in comparison to 2022 FIS, which ran from the 27th of May to the 15th of September, and the 2021 FIS, which ran from the 28th of May to the 14th of September. 8 vessels participated in the Fishery Independent Set Line Survey in 2023. There was also 8 vessels in 2022, and 13 vessels participated in 2021. 958 stations were planned for the 2023 Fishery Independent Set Line Survey, in comparison to 1,188 stations in 2022 and 1,346 stations in 2021. Now, this graphic is going to show a breakdown of our planned stations for 2023 and those stations that were successfully sampled, as well as 103 stations that, while they were planned, were unsampled or deemed ineffective. Please note that this total does not match the 958, as there were rockfish index stations included off the coast of Washington, as well as an additional station added to Trinity to ensure 100% sampling was completed in Trinity. And then the Bering Sea trawl stations are also labeled in this graphic. For the 2023 Fishery Independent Set Line Survey, there were 29 stations deemed ineffective. As has been the standard pattern over the past number of years, the majority of these ineffective stations were due to whale depredation. This past year in particular, we saw 16 stations total that were deemed ineffective due to sperm whale depredation. 8 of those stations occurred in 2B, whereas there were 4 in 2C and 4 in 3B. There also were 3 stations in regulatory area 3B where we saw shark depredation, and 3 stations in regulatory area 2B where there was orca depredation. There also were a number of what I would consider overall like logistical issues that ultimately led to ineffective stations, where there were either a gear issue or soak time. Gear issues generally tended to be due to some sort of weather-related issue. Other gear issues, the vessels were generally able to reset, and ultimately the station would be deemed effective in those other cases. And then there was also 1 station due to pinniped depredation in regulatory area 3B. So 29 stations for 2023. However, this graphic I think is a better look overall the past year's comparisons. Instead of looking at the number of stations, this will show you the percentage of ineffective stations each year. Noting that navy blue color is whale depredation. And as you can see, there has been the majority of ineffective stations have been due to whale depredation over the past several years. Earlier on in the earlier 2000s, we had significant shark depredation, which is the larger yellow that you'll see from 2001 through like 2005. Also note that we do also tend to have an overall higher percentage over the past few years when we complete work out in Area 4, as we do tend to encounter more whales in that regulatory area, which then lead to more ineffective stations and a higher percentage overall, as you can see. The secondary objective of the Fishery Independent Set Line Survey is currently for long-term revenue neutrality, which we strive to achieve through a fish sales process that is continuously improved year after year. We announce a request for tender for each sale, and these bids are rated against specified criteria that are provided to all interested buyers on the provided sales notice. We've established controls for this review and approval of each sale, and new in 2023, we have begun opening the bids to multiple ports to increase options. to expand on that, particularly in Southeast Alaska, we would cover from Sitka as far south as even going over the border to Prince Rupert for one given sale in Southeast Alaska, just to increase competition and have a better idea of prices that are available. And also our charter agreements continue to improve year after year, with requests for tenders being announced, and all submissions are rated against the same specified criteria, which are published in the tender specifications. Additionally, to further strive to achieve revenue neutrality, the past few years we have sold our sampled sublegal U32 Pacific halibut, noting that in 2023, as has been in the past few years, the price has been slightly less for these sublegal fish. In 2023, we saw that the price was on average 22% less than the average price of O32 Pacific halibut. And our tertiary objective for the Fishery Independent Setline Survey is collaboration. 2023, we collaborated with Alaska NOAA Fisheries, doing Pacific cod and spiny dogfish sampling. In Regulatory Area 2B, we collaborated with DFO, Archipelago, and PHMA to conduct dockside rockfish sampling, where IPHC Secretariat tagged fish on board and collaborated with dockside samplers for additional rockfish sampling in that regulatory area. And we also collaborated with Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife to complete 8 rockfish index stations off the coast of Washington, where 100% hook sampling took place, as well as providing the means for rockfish dockside sampling for all FIS stations completed off the coast of Washington. This slide provides links to our IPHC website and all of the various visualizations where you can review the 2023 FIS results. And then moving forward, the average price per pound in US dollars by IPHC regulatory area compares the average price that we received in the 2023 FIS in comparison to the 2022 season. Please note that these prices were adjusted to account for the inflation from 2022 to this last year. In average, we had a coastwide average price of $6.04 for the 2023 FIS in comparison to 2022, where we had a coastwide average price of $8.05. Now, this graphic also shows the trend of average price coastwide. Again, the inflation has been accounted for, so we are looking at an apples to apples comparison here, dating back through 2000 to 2023. And as you can see, there was a sizable price decrease in our average price from 2022 to 2023. And then Pacific halibut sales in US dollars by IPHC regulatory area. Noting again, these prices have been adjusted for inflation. In 2022, we had a total coastwide total of $3,332,254. And in 2023, we had a total of $3,094,009. Also, you will note that if we go to regulatory area 3B, you'll see that in 2023, we did make a significant more amount of money. However, in 2022, that sum total of $240,292,000 was actually just from 2 regions that were completed in all of regulatory area 3B. So there was an additional number of stations completed in 2023, which accounted for that increase. And that brings me just to mention the challenges that we faced yet again in 2023. As I've mentioned previously, we did see poor catch rates in areas and significantly lower fish prices. For another year, we've had minimal vessel bids due to various reasons. Vessels were unavailable to participate in the Fishery Independent Setline Survey, particularly the sizable sablefish quota. Also, the vessel size for some of the potential newer snappier vessels that may have been interested in participating. Particularly, we noticed a lot of snap vessels that would have otherwise been interested couldn't meet our tender specifications as far as having sufficient deck space as well as space for a secretariat. And then for another year, there has been some vessels that have historically participated in the Fishery Independent Satellite Survey, but unfortunately were ongoing extensive maintenance and were unable to participate this year. And with that, I would like to recommend the Commission note paper 8, Rev 1, and that provides a summary of the IPHC Fishery Independent Satellite Survey design and implementation in 2023. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Kayla. I'm going to start with a softball and see if you'd like to make a plug for your session tomorrow evening.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes. So tomorrow night we will have a Fishery Independent Setline Survey 2024 information session. I believe, and I'm going to kind of look at Dr. Wilson here if he knows, I believe that will be located here in this room. And me and others from the Secretariat will be present to answer questions and hopefully provide information for you if you're interested in the 2024 survey or just interested in the survey as a whole. I'd love to meet with you, and I will be available all week. So even if tomorrow night doesn't work, I'll be here. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that. And, needless to say, getting bids, having industry participation in this is absolutely essential for the success of the Setline survey. So thank you for that. Commissioners, any questions? Peter.
Hi, Kayla. One of the things you highlighted was the average price being considerably less than the previous year.
Yeah.
Even considering, with inflation. In talking with the buyers, were they giving you reasons why? And did they give you any indication of, you're just getting the bids, I guess, but I'm sure you have some back and forth. And so was there any, reasons why things were so down? Was there a theme that came through? And what do you expect for next year? Or have you talked to them about that as of yet?
Thank you, Commissioner. I will say one of the big conversations I'd like to have with those representatives that are here this week, I'd like to have that conversation. However, during the season, the conversations that I had with buyers was that 2022 prices were so high that they were treating 2023 as, okay, we have to hang back to kind of compensate for the higher prices that were being paid in 2022 and kind of make up for their loss. With that said, I heard an iffy response on, well, maybe it'll even out this upcoming year, but that's certainly the kind of conversations I'd love to hear more information on this week from others.
Yeah, thanks for that. Yeah. Also, there was I have a question around gear issues on the survey. And you said weather related, et cetera.
Mm-hmm.
Is that like lost gear as well? And if so, like what are your specifications for trying to recover lost gear? And did they have to drag for it for a certain amount of time, or would anything?
Yes, thank you, Commissioner. Yes, so vessels are required to drag for the lost gear. Forgive me, I don't recall the exact amount of time that they're required off the top of my head. However, it is provided in the tender specifications, that exact amount of time that it's expected. We also require that at least 4 skates of gear are retrieved to be deemed effective. And then also within our tender specifications, it is written out that if in real time, if they note that the station will be ineffective, they should make every effort to reset the station noting that there were certain circumstances where weather was particularly poor and it was towards the end of the season. And it was a matter of we can't even stay out here to complete the work at all, let alone, reset it.
Yeah. Okay, folks, if you can take your seats, we're going to get started again.
And Secretariat, while that's occurring, if we could just bring up the presentation for paper 09, please. And Dr. Webster, if you'd like to come up.
All right, folks, we're going to reconvene. Dr. Webster, if you can come on up. So this brings us to agenda item 5, or 5.1 specifically, space-time modeling of survey data. Dr. Ray Webster.
Okay, good afternoon. This is my shorter presentation. The longer one will come later, probably tomorrow. But this is a review of the output of the space-time modeling this year in terms of the trends in the indices that we've seen over the last number of years. So space-time model, we've been using it since 2016 to estimate O32 and all sizes weight per unit effort and all sizes numbers per unit effort indices from 1993 onwards. And for IPHC regulatory areas 4A and 4CD, EE, the modeling uses data from FIS and agency troll surveys, whereas other areas were only using FIS data in the modeling. And we use a color calibration to convert troll data to a FIS equivalent. The raw station data are adjusted for hook competition and the timing of the FIS relative to the fishery. The models predict the indices at all grid stations, whether they were surveyed in a given year or not. So estimates are calculated as averages across all station predictions. So what I mean by that is the estimate for an index in a given year by regulatory area, by region, or coastwide is an average across all the predictions at each of the stations, whether they were fished or not. So lack of sampling or reduced sampling is reflected in greater uncertainty. If we have some stations that are missed in a given year, or we have some ineffective stations, that might lead to higher variances or coefficients of variation, which are measures of relative variability. And we get official IPHC estimates for biological regions, IPHC regulatory areas, and coastwide convention waters from San Francisco Bay to the Bering Strait. And the station level output is supplied to the online IPHC Spacetime Explorer tool, which is available on our website. You can explore the output for the space-time model going all the way back to 1993 for different indices, or select your own area of interest and look at that. And you'll find that looking for the FIS output on the website. So this is the output from the space-time model for O32 weight per unit effort by biological region. And so we have region 2, 3, 4, 4B, and the coastwide estimate at the end. The percentages in the lower left-hand corner of each panel represent the estimated change in the index from 2022 to 2023. The dots, the points in each panel represent the estimated index itself. The shaded regions are a measure of uncertainty. Wider regions represent greater estimate, and these are the 95% credible intervals. That means that we expect the true value of the index to be within those shaded regions 95% of the time. Okay, so we can see that from 22 to 23, we had a coastwide decline of estimated coastwide decline of 3%. That was largely driven by a decline of 6% in region 3, and then smaller changes from 22 to 23 in other regions. For all size weight per unit effort, we have an estimated coastwide change of -4% from 2022 to 23, again driven largely by the change in Region 3, estimated to be 8% down from 2022. Numbers per unit effort, coast-wide change was quite small for numbers per unit effort, 2%. And Region 3 had the larger change of the regions. Should note that for regions like Region 4B in particular, we had no sampling in 2023. So you should interpret that estimate of 5% increase with a great deal of caution. You can see those shaded regions are quite wide for Area 4B in particular. They're also somewhat wide for Region 4. We had no sampling from the FIS in Region 4, but we did have data from the NIMS and ADFNG troll survey, troll survey on the in Region 4, and ADFNG troll survey, yes, in the Bering Sea. So be cautious in your interpretation of the change in 4B. It probably doesn't mean very much. In 2023, we also used snap gear as part of the standard FIS for the first time. And one vessel fished snap gear in 2 charter regions in IPHC Regulatory Area 3A. These data included in the space-time modeling, along with data from the 2021 gear comparison experiment, which is done in a different charter region in Regulatory Area 3A by a different vessel. So the additional data have allowed us to revise our estimates of the ratio of catch rates between the 2 gear types in 3A and reduced uncertainty in those estimates. So in the 2021 study, we only had one vessel fishing one region, and the result was that we estimated that the snap gear, once adjusting for hook competition and so on, had higher catch rates than the fixed gear, which was not consistent with what we'd seen in previous studies in regulatory areas 2B and 2C, which showed the reverse. And unfortunately, with that study in 3A in 2021, we couldn't untangle the effect of the gear from the effect of the vessel or the timing, which was different from the snap gear vessel and the fixed gear vessel that was fishing that same region. So it was hard to conclude what was driving that difference between the 2 gear types, impossible to conclude. So now we have data from 2023, which has a different vessel, it fished different areas. And so the effect of that on the estimate of the difference between 2 gear types is that that difference has now been reduced. And so it's bringing it closer to the estimate of the differences we saw in 2B and 2C in previous years. So as we get more data from SNAP vessels coming into future FIS in coming years, then that will allow us to refine that estimate and give us a more general estimate of the difference between those 2 gear types than we have from an estimate that now is from 2 vessels in 3 charter regions. So 2023 still allowed us to improve our understanding of that difference. And while we include the data in the space-time model, we also account for that difference as well. So we're making predictions at each station for the index as if that station had been fixed with fish gear, regardless of what was actually fishing it. So we're making an in-model adjustment for gear type. So this was a short presentation. The recommendation is simply that the Commission note the accompanying paper, which provides the results of the space-time modeling of Pacific halibut survey data for 93 to 23. Happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much. Commissioners, any questions for Dr. Webster? Richard.
Yes, Dr. Webster, on the charts you give for weight per unit effort, I see there's overall a decline, weight per unit effort. But I see in some regions the number per unit effort is up. Could this be due to the size of fish they were fishing on or the year class they're fishing on? So really it's not an indication of the stock biomass, but just the year class. There's smaller fish coming through, but no more numbers of them. So they kind of, it's an indication of not the overall nature of the stock, but just the classes that we're fishing on.
Thank you, Commissioner Yamada. I'm sure my colleague, Dr. Stewart, can give a better answer for that. I think you're correct. We're getting more smaller fish coming into the stock, at least being captured by the the fish relative to larger fish that we've seen in recent years. And we've noticed this in the last couple of years as well, where the numbers per unit effort indices have been more stable than the all sizes indices have been more stable than the O32 indices, which indicates that we have greater changes in or declines in the larger fish sizes than we have in the smaller fish sizes.
Thank you.
Peter?
Yeah, thank you, Ray, for Dr. Webster. Question about estimations are calculated as averages across station predictions. You only use the stations that are immediate to any other station, right? Like you don't expand out 50 miles or anything like that, right? Like I've heard that said before, but I don't think that's accurate.
So we let the model decide. So the model is one of the parameters of the model is the distance at which nearby stations continue to be influential on, say, a prediction at a station which you didn't get any data. And that's typically not 50 nautical miles, but it could be up to 30 nautical miles. But as distance increases, the amount of influence decreases quite sharply. So at 30 nautical miles, there might be a correlation of if I can remember, like 10%, something relatively low, whereas close in you're getting correlations of much higher. So if effectively the most of the information that's informing a station in which you didn't get any data for a given year comes from the closest stations and from what you got in previous years at that station. So if this is a station that historically has been getting lower than average catch rates, the prediction will still get a lower than average value because the past information is informing that, and presumably it's surrounded by stations that are also somewhat lower in catch rate as well. So it's a little more complicated than just the immediate near stations, but those are the most influential ones in informing that prediction.
Yeah, or the past.
Or the past, exactly. Yeah.
Okay. One other question on, Region 4 that wasn't sampled other than through trawl survey. Trawl survey, they catch, generally smaller fish. How does that weight how things are changing? Like, how do you use that trawl survey when you're catching so much of a different stock of fish or proportion of fish?
Thank you for the question, Commissioner DeGrief. That's a good one. And we do this through a calibration between the two gear types. So we had overlapping surveys in 2006 and 2015 when we undertook a FIS in the Bering Sea in the shallow waters, and the NIMS trawl survey fished their standard grid. And so by looking at the size distributions of the FIS gear and the size distribution of the trawl gear, we could come up with a calibration to say what's a trawl fish worth depending on size relative to the FIS. And so the FIS doesn't catch fish very often, less than 50 centimeters in length. So if the trawl survey is catching those fish, we essentially don't count them in the index. And so when we will upweight the larger size fish so that the two size distributions match. So the idea is that when we're doing the trawl, when we get the trawl survey data, but we don't have the FIS survey data, we can use the information from when they overlapped to still get an index that's consistent with a FIS index. So what we're getting out of the trawl survey data is still a FIS index. There's an extra step involved in getting that from just the raw FIS data.
Thank you very much. Paul?
Thanks very much for the presentation, Dr. Webster. I just wanted to confirm you were commenting on the experiments with snap gear versus fixed gear. And I guess just to summarize, are you now satisfied that you have enough information to make the comparison between the two over the three studies? I think that's what you said, but I just wanted to confirm.
I think given the information we have, we're comfortable fishing snap gear and allowing the model to account for any differences that are there. And over those experiments that we did in 2C and 2B, we've been using those experimental data within the space-time modeling the whole time. knowing that we can, if there are differences between the two gear types, the model will allow for that when we're making the prediction. So we are confident we can get a consistent prediction, whatever gear type was fished, by making within model adjustments for gear type. So I think we're comfortable going forwards if snap vessels are coming into the fishery, if snap vessels are coming into the FIS, we're comfortable with that we can use those data in a consistent manner with the fixed data. And the more snap vessels we have, the more information we have to understand those differences as well, unconfounded with other factors like area or vessel.
All right, thank you.
I think that was a yes.
It's a yes.
Qualified. Thank you. Bob?
Dr. Webster, in looking at slide 8, and just as an example, all sizes, weight per unit of effort on the far right column, 0.90 to 1.30. Do I read that there's a 40% differential potential between snap and fixed?
Yeah, sorry, thank you, Commissioner Robinson. Probably didn't explain what is on this slide enough. So the thing I call the posterior mean, which is basically the average difference between the two gear types across the stations. If it's greater than 1, that means snap gear had a higher average, adjusted for competition average catch rate than fixed gear. And if it's something like looking at all sizes, weight per unit, if at 1.08, it was 8% higher on average. The critical interval means there's a 95% chance that the ratio was between 0.9 and 1.3. So it might have been 10% less, or it might have been 30% more, or somewhere in between. So not 40% more or 40% less, but it could have been as snap gear could have been fishing a 10% lower catch rate than fixed gear, or up to 30% higher catch rate. Hopefully that helps.
Anything else on this? Okay, thank you, Dr. Webster.
Thank you.
And I think we're ready to go to the stock assessment. Dr. Stewart.
Okay, good afternoon, commissioners, everybody who's here. I'll be walking through this afternoon the first of 2 presentations, this one describing the overview of data sources from this year and a partial recap of some of the presentations you've heard already, as well as the results of this year's stock assessment. And then I believe tomorrow morning I'll be going through the stock projections for the next 1 to 3 years, as well as some consideration of reference points and projected yields. So I'll begin with the assessment summary, the major salient bullet points from this year's results. The first is that we see fishing mortality down slightly in 2023 as a function of the reduced catch limits that were adopted by the Commission last year. We saw, as you just observed in Dr. Webster's presentation, the FIS was down between 2 and 4%, depending on whether you're looking at numbers, pounds, or legal pounds. However, the fishery was down 12%, and that's, as you'll see, that's going to have an important effect on this year's stock assessment results. We have several important year classes in the water right now. The 2012 year class is comprising the primary source of catch for both the commercial fishery and our fishery independent set line survey. We have another year class coming behind that, 2014, but it's estimated to be even smaller than 2012. And these are the 2 year classes, the 2 best year classes we've seen since 2005. So this really is the story, is that we are waiting on another decent year class to come through. In terms of the biology of these fish, weighted age has been mixed. We have, over the last couple of years, started to see some improving trends, particularly for younger fish in some areas. But we're not seeing a huge amount of rapid change in weighted age, nor would we expect to. This is a process that changes slowly over time. There is some information from trawl surveys, recreational fishery, other places, indicating the potential for a 2016 to 2018 year class or year classes. But it will be several more years until we have good observations of those both in the FIS and in the commercial fishery. So although there's some promise there, is nothing we can take to the bank yet. In terms of the biomass results, the spawning biomass is estimated to be nearly flat, actually increasing by 2% from 2023 to 2024. And the stock is estimated to be at 42% of the biomass that would be in the water if we hadn't been fishing on the stock. So we are not in the conservation zone nor approaching our limit, although the overall absolute level of biomass and numbers of fish in the water is very low. In terms of fishing intensity, or how hard we're fishing on the stock, 2023 was the lowest in recent years, again, responding to the reduced mortality limits last year, and with a relatively stable spawning biomass, we see another drop in fishing intensity. So that's the summary. Now I'll go through the details, and I'll work through, as I usually do, I'll start with the data sources. We'll look at the fisheries, the Fishery Independent Setline Survey again, and other sources of supplementary data. And then once you've had a chance to look at the data sources without any modeling associated with it, then we'll look through the results of this year's stock assessment. So this is a time series of mortality from all sources for Pacific halibut. You can see the historical ups and downs that we've seen in these, the directed fishery in particular, but in the other components as well. We had a low period in the late 1970s to the early 1980s. Followed by two peaks in yield, with the largest yields coming in the early 2000s. And we had that long decline from the early 2000s through about 2012. And since then, we've been in the ballpark of 40 million pounds over approximately the last decade. The mortality estimates that we projected from last year's annual meeting are shown here in this first table. You'll note that we were projecting, given the catch limits that were adopted, we would see a total mortality of just over 38 million pounds. However, when the fisheries actually played out, the values that we had estimated for this year's stock assessment, and I'll note that there may be some small differences between these numbers and the numbers you saw from Dr. Hudsonzak, and that's because she's got more updated numbers through the end of the calendar year. In some cases, the numbers that I did the assessment on back in November won't be quite as updated as those. But I want to show you what went into the assessment, because that's what's important for the results you're about to see. So estimated for this year's stock assessment analysis, you see we came in just under 36 million pounds. So collectively, the various sectors left a couple million pounds in the water that we had expected to be caught, particularly the commercial fishery landings. The commercial discards came in slightly lower, although I think the rate is quite similar. Recreational fisheries down slightly. And non-directed discards were initially estimated to have gone up slightly. However, we did get an update in January, which is included in the projections that I'll be showing you tomorrow, indicating that this number was actually somewhat lower than our initial estimate. And so you'll recall that the Commission several years ago adopted the approach of using a 3-year running average for non-directed discards, since those values do bounce up and down year to year. And so that 3-year average moving into the projections for 2024 would be 4.42. So a relatively low value compared to the greater time series. If we look at this another way, this is the time series since 2013 of the TCEY, shown in blue, and the mortality accruing to the TCEY, shown as the gray bars. And you see, historically, we were pretty much spot on every year. We caught basically the whole quota, and all the fisheries were fully attained. Beginning in 2020, we started to see fisheries that weren't catching all of what we had projected, and that pattern has persisted through 2021, 2022, and into 2023 now. Noting, though, that the offset between what was caught and the limits actually has been about the same over this last 4-year period. They're coming in a little bit lower, but consistently so. If we drill in just a little bit farther, so this figure shows you a time series back to 1990 of recent non-directed discard mortality, or bycatch. And you can see the very strong trend there from what was almost the highest value that had been observed in 1992 through a pretty steady decline all the way to 2021 was the lowest value in the time series, I believe, just over 3.8 million pounds. We saw some increase in 2022 and then a slight decrease again in 2023. Again, these are the numbers updated through the end of the calendar year. Of note here, you'll see that Area 4 C, D, and E is the green series. That has historically and continues to comprise the majority of non-directed discard mortality on the Pacific halibut stock occurs in IPHC regulatory area 4 C, D, and E. The second largest component historically was IPHC regulatory area 3A, and I highlight that here. It's the reddish series with the squares, and through about 2019, that pattern held. That was a large component of the non-directed discard mortality. It declined pretty sharply in 2020 and again in 2021. In the last few years, it's been much lower. So this is a component that we did have some concern over historically, but due to reductions in the fisheries for other species going on in this area, the overall mortality of Pacific halibut has decreased pretty substantially for IPHC regulatory area 3A. Okay, now you just saw several figures from Dr. Webster with the results. This figure compares all three of those, the coastwide trend in terms of numbers per skate, total pounds per skate, and legal pounds per skate on the right. And you see these three trends are all had about the same percent down in from 2022 to 2023. As Dr. Webster noted, the numbers per skate has been more stable. The decreases have been smaller in the left-hand panel than they have in the center and in the right. And that's because the numbers per skate is only responding to the number of fish that are in the water, where the pounds per skate is responding both to the numbers of fish as well as the size of those fish. And so particularly for that period from the late 1990s through around 2010, that was a period of strong decrease in size at age. And so for the same number of fish, we were getting less and less yield. And that's why those curves are steeper. Now I want to contrast this to what we saw last year. So this bottom panel shows you the same three panels from last year's survey results. And you'll note two things there. One, the drop was much sharper from 2021 to 2022, from 8 to 18%. And the second thing you'll notice is that there was a pretty marked difference between numbers and total and 0.32 pounds per skate, with the larger fish showing the biggest declines. This year, though, with -2, -4, and -3, these are all showing about the same amount of drop. And what that tells us is that we have largely transitioned from those older fish, particularly the 2005 year class that we've been catching in the survey and the fishery and been supporting the fishery, to younger fish. And now that what we're seeing in this year's survey response is just the change in the numbers of fish, not a big transition in the age structure of those fish. Okay, we can compare then the 0.32 weight per unit effort from our survey on the left to what is reported in the commercial fishery logbooks here, aggregated to the coastwide level and shown on the right. And you'll notice right away that the drop in the commercial fishery was similar from 2021 to 2022, but more pronounced this year from 2022 to 2023 in the commercial fishery, down 10%. And in fact, based on what we've seen in the logbooks toward the end of the fishing season, we would expect that to actually be more like a 12% drop. It could be a little larger or a little bit smaller than that. But generally, the logs that we collect early next year as we encounter boats or get mailed in, the logs that we missed at the end of this season generally have a lower catch rate than those throughout the rest of the season. So this is a big enough offset to take note of. We have frequently seen ups and downs in one of these two series. You'll notice if you look back through the early 2010 to 15 range, there's a couple of years when the survey goes up and the fishery goes down, or vice versa. That's not uncommon, but a difference of 15% is pretty substantial. And this, in fact, the commercial fishery information had a relatively strong effect on this year's stock assessment results. So this figure shows you a lot of detail of the various fishery components. Each panel represents an IPHC regulatory area, and the catch rates are broken out by the largest gear or sector components in each area. So the tribal and non-tribal fisheries in 2A, snap and fixed hook gear in the other areas, and then 4C and 4D separated in the in the bottom center panel there. Again, the coast-wide trend is the same one I showed you on the previous graph. And a couple takeaways here. One, you can see that we have historically had a pretty consistent offset between snap and fixed hook gear, with snap gear on average having a lower catch rate than fixed hook gear. The other thing you can see is that these two gear types don't always agree in all regulatory areas across all years. Some we have years when they go up and years when they go down, sometimes together and sometimes not. We tend to see as much variability between the gear types as we see between the commercial fishery and the fishery independent set line survey. These are all different ways to sample the population. Boats fish in different places. The survey fishes only in the summer, where the fishery spread out over the full fishing season. So we would expect to see some variability there. But pretty consistently across the board, we're seeing larger decreases across both gear types than we saw in the fishery independent set line survey. Now I want to highlight 2C because it's reasonable to wonder, given the somewhat reduced survey footprint we had in 2023, whether some of this difference between the commercial fishery trend and the survey trend might be attributable just to the reduced footprint that we had in 2023. And so I'm highlighting 2C because this is an area where we in fact fished all the survey stations, and we had pretty good information available even in the beginning of November from the logbooks. We had a large number of logbook records. And so here I think we have good sampling from both sources, and you can see that there's still that offset between the commercial catch rates and the fishery catch rates. So there's something beyond just the survey design that we achieved in 2023 that's leading to this difference between the commercial and the survey catch rates in this most recent year. I'll move now into some of the biological observations. So this graphic shows you the age composition information. So year across the x-axis, across the bottom, and age on the y-axis or up the side. And the size of the circle indicates the proportion of the survey catch in numbers of fish in that year at that age. So a big circle means we caught a lot of fish at that age. And a strong diagonal pattern indicates a strong year class. So if we have a strong year class, for example, these three that I've highlighted here, those show up as large circles that move in a diagonal pattern because every year the fish get 1 year older. So they're moving up 1 year and to the right 1 year. And those year classes are the 87 year class, the 2005 year class, and the 2012 year class. And I highlight these because although there have been plenty of other year classes in between, these three have been particularly important to the fishery as it's played out. The 1987 year class, when we go back and reconstruct the amount of catch that came out of that year class over the several decades that we've been catching it, there's still a very few of them that show up in the catch. We have removed approximately 220 million pounds just from this single year class over time. And that's how we know this year class was the largest year class in the entire 100-year time series that we have, because we've counted those fish, we've now caught them, we've measured them, and we've collected the otoliths from them. So that year class was by itself responsible for a major improvement in productivity in this stock over the years when it was primarily in the fishery. And that was the mid-90s through the early 2000s. That was this was the backbone of the fishery during that time period. The 2005 year class I highlight because it was the most recent large year class, and we've been fishing on that year class for a number of years. You'll note there's a bit of a gap in the age structure between 2005 and 2012. We've got 6 low recruitments in a row leading up to 2012. And that's really what's been driving the recent dynamics in the stock. If we look at the same information, but we look at the commercial fishery, you can see those same diagonals, maybe not quite as pronounced, in part because we don't see the younger fish. If I go back, you can see we're seeing on the survey, we're seeing a few 5-year-olds, some 6-year-olds, and then a fair number of 7, 8, and 9-year-olds. In the fishery, we see almost no 5-year-olds, almost no 6-year-olds, very few 7-year-olds, and then a few 8s, more 9s, but the fishery is focused on larger fish. And this is primarily because of the gear selectivity and the minimum size limit. So particularly for males, these fish aren't reaching the minimum size limit until they're 10 years or older. In large part. And for females, they're not selected by the gear at smaller sizes as they are in the survey, but that minimum size limit crops off the 6, 7s, and 8s largely. You can see at the end of this time series here, the largest circle for 2023 is the 2012 year class. And so this is the second year in a row when the fishery has caught more of that 2012 year class than any other cohort that's in the water right now. You'll note that from 2017 to 2022, we have sex-specific information. We now take a fin clip from every fish that's sampled in port. It goes back to the office. We use a genetic assay to determine males and females. And this gives us very good information about the effect of fishing on the Pacific halibut stock, because we know what fraction of females we're taking. We know exactly how that corresponds to the reproductive output of the stock. And this has been a huge success for our research program. This is a piece of information that for 100 years we didn't have, and turns out to be very important for the Pacific halibut stock. We now understand that the catch is approximately 80 to 85% female, and that's not a bad thing as long as we know it. And we didn't, up until 2019, we didn't have direct information on this. We knew the fishery was primarily female, but we didn't have a specific quantitative estimate of that percentage. And now we do. So this has been a huge step forward. Though that information lags by 1 year, so they'll be processing the 2023 samples over the spring and summer, and we'll have those for next year's stock assessment. And that's why I don't have sex-specific information for 2023 in this graphic. Now, as we've collected more and more of this information, this graphic shows you the relationship between the average age of fish in the catch and the percent female. And now that we have all this information from 2017 all the way to 2022, we can start to see some very clear patterns here. So the first thing you'll notice is that there's a very strong relationship between the average age of fish and the percent female. And what this means is that if the fishery is catching younger fish, we are catching a higher fraction female, because the younger males are just not making it above the minimum size limit. So that's a feedback loop. As we start to catch younger fish, we're having a larger effect on the reproductive output of the stock. And so that's a negative feedback loop in times when we have to shift, when the fishery has to shift toward younger and younger fish. The next thing you'll notice on this figure is that we see some quite consistent patterns across the biological regions. And I realize the colors on this room's projectors aren't great, but from left to right, from younger to older fish, we see region 4 in the top left, and then region 2, region 3, and then 4B consistently turns out fish that are several years older than the other regions. And because of that, they're also a higher percent male. And so that fishery has a different effect on the stock than the fisheries in other regions. So this is really critical information that we now have at our fingertips. And we're extending this time series as we go along. So a little more on the biology. This figure shows you the average weight of a fish, of the fish that were sampled that coming to the dock over the last 35 years. And you can see a lot of variability within each IPHC regulatory area, particularly 2C, which has historically landed the largest average weight fish anywhere on the coast, has had some pretty large swings up and down in the last several years. The average size fish in 2021 was much closer to the coastwide average, and then it's been going up quite rapidly in 2C from the fish that were landed by the commercial fishery. However, at the coastwide average, which is the black line down the center, you can see that we had that long decline from the 90s through about 2011. And then since then, the average weight of a fish at the dock has been actually fairly consistent. So we've seen some shift in the age structure of the stock, but that's been slightly offset by some improvements in size at age. And again, so the case of the shrinking halibut really was going on until about 2011. And since then, we've had a pretty stable average size in our fishery. If we look back even farther, so this figure reconstructs the weighted age. Now, the landings include both the weighted age and the age of the fish. So if the age changes, we would expect the weight to change, or if the size at age changes. If we isolate just to size at age, we can think about how have these fish changed over time. And this is our reconstruction that goes back to 1935. We have catch at age information going all the way back through all of the decades. And you can see from this reconstruction that the fish were fairly small for their age in the 30s, 40s, and 50s. There was a rather rapid and large increase in weighted age through sometime in the late 1970s. And then a long decline through the early 2000s. And since then, as I noted in the last figure, we've seen some flattening of that trend. And in fact, at the very end of the time series, we're starting to see the younger fish improving in weighted age. And we don't know exactly the factors that are driving this. There have been analyses looking at diet, competition with other species, density dependence of the halibut stock itself. More halibut means they don't grow as fast. And all of these things, and fishing as well. And all of these things may be contributing. It doesn't seem to be a single factor that we can isolate to explain this whole time series. But the takeaway from this is that we are seeing some improvement in the younger fish at the end of the time series, but this is a slow process. And even if this improvement continues, it's not going to appreciably change the yields except over a period of decades. So the next result that we get from the Fishery Independent Setline Survey is an estimate of how the stock is distributed each year. This graphic shows you just a reminder of the 4 biological regions that we use to describe this stock. And for each of these regions, we can estimate the percent of the biomass that occurs in that particular region in that year. Note that each of these panels is on a different scale. So the y-axis is different. The y-axis is the percent of the stock that's occurring in that region. And we put them on a different scale because otherwise you wouldn't see the trends in each area. But I'll call out some of the important points here. The first is in Region 2, where in 2023, we've reached 26% of the coastwide stock, which is the largest percent of the coastwide stock distributed on the east side that we've seen since we have been able to measure stock distribution in the early 1990s. Conversely, in the core of the stock, we're now down to 45% in Region 3. That's 3A and 3B. And this is the lowest that we've seen since the early 1990s. Now, there are a lot of factors that affect the stock distribution. It's both movement of fish as well as the distribution of recruits and the size at age that can be different in each of these areas. So it's not as simple as fish just moving from one area to another. But nonetheless, this does have implications for how the spawning biomass is likely to be distributed across these biological regions, noting that we have an objective to maintain at least some level of spawning biomass across all biological regions, so that should the conditions become favorable within any of the regions, we always have spawners there to capitalize on that. The last thing I'll highlight here is Region 4B in the bottom left. That our best estimate is that the percentage of the stock has increased to approximately 6%. But I'll call your eye to the shaded interval there. That's the uncertainty in that estimate. As you saw from Kayla's presentation, we didn't have any direct sampling in 4B in 2023. So we don't know exactly what's going on out there. And that's why if you look at that shaded region, the true trend could be going down or it could be going up. And as Dr. Cox pointed out in the SRB presentation, this is one of the first things that we lose as we get to a more sparse survey design. We can maintain a pretty good estimate of the overall trend, but we start to lose information on the distribution of the stock more quickly. And we're seeing that exactly happening in 4B, having sampled only very lightly there in 2022 and then not at all in 2023. So very quickly, the uncertainty balloons out in these areas when we don't have direct sampling. Okay, another metric that we calculate each year from our Fishery Independent Setline Survey is what we call an empirical harvest rate. And this doesn't have any stock assessment model behind it. It makes no assumption about age structure or anything else. It just takes the mortality that occurred in that area and divides that by the survey index. Because it's a survey index, we don't know the units. We can't calculate the actual harvest rate. This is a relative harvest rate. But by comparing these two things, we can get a sense of how much we were catching compared to how much we saw there in the summer that we did the survey of that year. And so these are comparable across regions, and they're comparable within region across time. And they're also, this particular graphic is standardized so that the coast-wide value in 2023 is a value of 1. And that's just an arbitrary choice. It doesn't matter. You can't interpret the units. You can just compare across these various regions and time periods. And so you can see right away that historically we've harvested much more heavily in Region 2 than any of the other areas, with Region 4 and 4B both having periods of much lower exploitation rate. You can also see that exploitation rates in all the regions and coastwide were at their peak in the middle of this time series. So this would be right around the early 2000s when we were extracting the largest harvests that we really ever have out of this stock. So all of the harvest rates were higher during that period. So again, this is just a model-free way to think about how hard have we been fishing each of these stock components. Okay, moving now into the conditions that these fish are experiencing. So we long ago discovered the correlation between the Pacific Decadal Oscillation and recruitment, or the number of young Pacific halibut coming into the stock each year. This was not something I figured out. This was well back in time, over 20 years ago. Stephen Hare and Bill Clark found this relationship, tested it over the time series, and found that when the Pacific Decadal Oscillation, which is what's shown on this particular figure here, when it's in a positive phase, so these are points above the line shown here on this figure in green, we tend on average to have higher recruitment or larger numbers of Pacific halibut entering the stock. Conversely, when the PDO is negative, on average, we have lower numbers of fish entering the stock. However, this doesn't predict individual year classes well at all. We can still have a good year class when the PDO is negative, and we can certainly have bad ones when the PDO is positive. But over 100 years, we've seen this correlation, and it continues to hold up today. And so I present this not because it's necessarily a good predictor of specific future year classes, but because it's the only information we have about some of these upcoming year classes. And I'd highlight this period here from 2014 to 2019, where we did have a positive PDO over that time period. And then after 2019, the PDO has gone back to strongly negative, a strong negative phase. So again, over the next several years, we'll be actually seeing these fish on the water to see whether, on average, we did get better recruitment or not during this time period. Now, there's more going on than just the PDO. So this slide summarizes a huge amount of work by NOAA fisheries, DFO scientists, and others looking at the environmental conditions. Where we've had major anomalies in the Bering Sea over the last 10 years, the last couple of years have been more normal. The Aleutian Islands, however, have continued to have warm water. We're now seeing a decade or more of above average warm water occurring in the Aleutians. And what that's done is it's changed some of the biological relationships in that area. Things that used to be closely linked, like temperature and PDO, aren't really doing that anymore. The PDO changes, but the temperature's not changing in the Aleutians. And we don't know what that means for Pacific halibut stocks out there, but what it certainly means is that historical correlations are probably less likely to hold up given change in a whole bunch of these different factors. So predictability is low. And we continue to see change in a number of indicators, and moving down the coast through the Gulf of Alaska into British Columbia, we're seeing a similar thing in British Columbia and the California Current, where both of those systems have more upwelling, and we're seeing mixed productivity and mixed response across a variety of species. So there's a vast amount of information on this, but I think the takeaway for Pacific halibut is not necessarily that any of these conditions are necessarily bad or good for Pacific halibut, but just that our ability to predict what's going to happen next is at an all-time low. So another piece of information that we get is from the NOAA Fisheries Trawl Surveys, and probably the most, the one that shows the most indication for Pacific halibut is the Bering Sea Trawl Survey. And this figure, it's a little bit busy, but it shows you from 1982 to 2023, sort of from far away to close up with the more recent years in the front. It shows you the distribution of fish by age that were caught in that trawl survey. So if I highlight a couple of these peaks, the first peak from the back of the graphic shows the 1987 year class, which was observed in the trawl survey. The next peak in the middle there shows the 2005 year class, which was also seen in the trawl survey, but interestingly enough, it looked like a much better year class in the trawl survey than 1987, even though we now know, because we've caught both of those year classes largely, that it wasn't a bigger year class than 1987. It was just more prevalent in the Bering Sea. At the end of the time series, you see there a mix of ages, but comprising 2017 or maybe 2017 and 2018 year classes. Again, another large peak, but we don't know whether this will correspond to a good recruitment coastwide for Pacific halibut or whether this is just a bunch of small fish in the Bering Sea, as we saw in 2005. And the caveats here are that, of course, not all Pacific halibut recruitment occurs in the Bering Sea. And that's our best understanding of why we see this mismatch, particularly for 2005 and 1987, is that the recruitment occurring in the rest of the stock is also critically important. In 1987, the fish appeared to just recruit everywhere. We had lots of young fish across the entire range. And again, it's going to be several more years until we get a good read on these from our direct observations in the Fishery Independent Setline Survey and in the commercial fisheries. So that concludes the summary of the data sources. Now I'll move into the modeling that we did for this year and the results from this year's stock assessment. To refresh your memory, our IPHC schedule for stock assessment is approximately a 3-year schedule. So we had a full stock assessment in 2015, and then we did updates for several years. We had another full stock assessment in 2019, and that 2019 assessment was the first assessment that we had these new commercial fishery sex ratio data, and that gave us a much better understanding of the effect of fishing on the Pacific halibut stock. Then we had updates in 2020 and 2021, and then in 2022 we had another full assessment, and the improvements that we made there were in the treatment of natural mortality. We're now estimating it based on the data that we have in hand rather than using a fixed value that had been in place for over 20 years and was no longer consistent with the information. We also made some improvements in data weighting across these models. So for 2023, the 2023 stock assessment was another update. And what that means is that we didn't make any major changes to the way the models are constructed or the way the results are put together from the stock assessment models. As Dr. Cox described earlier today, the SRB reviewed our development in June. And although this was an update and we didn't make any big changes, we did explore a bunch of different avenues for development, some of which may be able to be included in the next full assessment, and some of which were worth exploring but really didn't prove to be useful for the stock assessment. Then in September, we had a second review where the SRB made final recommendations on the exact format for the results that I'll be showing you here today. Just note, looking forward, we have planned another update in 2024, and then another full assessment is scheduled for 2025, at least tentatively. So one of the things that we did explore this year that we didn't include in the stock assessment model and whale depredation, of course, is becoming an increasing problem in longline fisheries around the world. We've been monitoring this, but we hadn't done a detailed look at whale depredation, particularly for the Pacific halibut fishery. So we first looked at the logbooks and we did a bunch of summary and we presented that to the SRB in June. And as you heard earlier, their recommendation was to also compare to observer records. So we contacted the appropriate agencies and got access to observer records and redid the analysis, also looking at observer records. And both of these data sets supported the observations that many of you all are quite familiar with, which is that Area 4 is where the orcas are, and 2C and 3A, particularly on the deeper shelf edge, is where the primary sperm whale depredation occurs. Both of these can occur in other areas, but these are the areas of highest encounter rates. We also took this exercise a little bit farther. We put these depredation rates into the stock assessment model. We accounted for the magnitude of depredation that was reported in the logbooks, and we used estimates from the Fishery Independent Setline Survey of when the whales are there, how much of the catch are they eating, knowing that the survey is not encountering them at the same rate as the fishery. But once they're there, we can better measure on the survey what's being lost to the whales. And in a nutshell, when we did this analysis, it was a wash. The spawning biomass goes up a little bit, then you subtract off what you'd expect the whales to eat next year, and you end up basically back to where the mortality limits are. Now, there are a couple of important caveats here. First, we can only do what we can with the numbers that we have in hand. So this analysis just represents the whale depredation that was reported in the logbooks. Interestingly, the logbooks were reporting a higher rate of whale encounters than we were seeing in the observer data. So we opted to use, in this case, the logbooks as an outside or an upper bound on the estimate. But again, It only represents what was reported. And secondarily, whale depredation has some other effects on our data sets. So it's not just that whale depredation can reduce the catch rate on a set because the whales are eating the fish, but it may also change the way people are fishing. And I know I've heard from many of you here that there are certain areas that aren't getting fished anymore because the whales are always there and it's not worth trying to fish there. And so that can have an effect on a secondary effect on catch rates as well, which is that you opt to fish in an area of lower catch rates to try and avoid the whales. And so you get lower catch rates, even though you might not have actually had an encounter with the whales. So these have a two-stage effect on fishery catch rates, at least potentially. And at this point, the SRB recommended that because of all the uncertainties in this, that we not try and formally include this in the stock assessment. But they did feel that this was helpful and that we should continue to evaluate the data in this manner, at least periodically moving forward. So that's as far as we got on that topic this year. With regard to the stock assessment itself, the basic mechanics of the stock assessment remain the same. We're using 4 different stock assessments that make 4 different assumptions about how to aggregate the data and how much data to use, long or short time series. Some of these do a slightly better job at capturing the spatial dynamics, and others do the better job of capturing the coastwide dynamics. We weight equally each of the 4 models. Despite a lot of work looking for a better method, this seems to be still a reasonable way to go on these 4 models. And again, because this is an update, we didn't make any major changes for 2023. I'll note that last year, we made a projection of what the Fishery Independent Setline Survey might see in terms of numbers of fish in the 2023 survey. And this graphic here shows you that we were projecting a slight increase in the catch rates, not much, but a very slight increase or flat trend in at least one of the models from 2022 to 2023. And this is before we had any of the data. When we actually got the data, what we found was a slight decrease in the numbers per unit effort in 2023. And so the right-hand panel shows you the fit to this year's model. So once we have this information, of course, we can fit it. And the models, the results that you'll see now are responding to this slight decrease in the time series. But I highlight this because we weren't necessarily expecting to see a big change in the survey, but we didn't expect it to go down either. Okay, to summarize the 4 different stock assessment models, you can see that there's a wide range of plausible biomass in the late 90s and early 2000s, because this is really when many of our data sets began to be more coastwide and comprehensive. We don't know exactly how much biomass occurred in that time period, but all the models project that, or estimate that that was the period of highest biomass in the last 35 years. We had that period of decline through about 2010. The stock flattened out. We had a slight increase from 2010 to about 2016 or 17, and this was the maturation of the 2005 year class. So as those fish grew up and joined the spawning biomass, we saw that increase in the overall coastwide spawning biomass. And then since then, as those fish have aged out and been caught, we've seen a slow decline in spawning biomass through the end of the time series. If we compare that to previous stock assessments, each of the red dots shows you the results of a previous stock assessment. All the way back to the 2012 stock assessment is the first red dot on the left-hand side of that series. The blue banding shows you the results from this year's stock assessment, and the blue line at the end of the time series shows you the median or the best estimate from this year's stock assessment. And if you look closely, you can see that the last 2 points, the last 2 red dots, are actually above this year's estimate. And that we did some investigation on looking at each data set sequentially to see which data sets were telling us that the stock was lower this year than we had estimated it to be last year. And it turns out that one data set really stood out. And that difference is approximately 11% at the 2023 spawning biomass estimate. The data set that stood out was the fishery logbook trend. So that sharp drop in the fishery logbooks, and it's not just the 2023 point. When we got the rest of the 2022 data, it also pulled the previous estimate down. So the 2022 went down from what we had during last year's stock assessment, and 2023 was substantially lower than we expected to see. And so those two observations together, when we took those back out, we got something that was very consistent with all of the other recent stock assessments. So all the fishery age data, the survey age data, the survey trends, that's all in this model. What's pulling the model down at the end of the time series is the fishery logbook trend information. So that illustrates a couple of things. One, fishery data is important. It's always been in the model, and under certain conditions, it actually has a fairly large effect on our understanding. And two, it's not that we're seeing necessarily the same signal across all data sets. So if I had done this and I had found that all the data sets were indicating the stock would be lower, I'd be asking myself, well, why was the model predicting that last year if all the data sets are telling us it was lower? But this is just one of the data sets that's telling us this year. So I think next year's observations, of course, are going to be really important to see how this balances out. Will we continue to see an offset with the commercial data or not? Is there something about 2022 and 23 that were different? But again, we won't know until we get some more information. Okay, moving now into what these models are estimating. So this is the time series of relative recruitment. I've taken the output from each of the 4 models and just divided it by the average over this time period, so they're all comparable. And what that allows us to do is identify where the big year classes are and where the small year classes are. And so you can see right in the middle of the graph, 2005 is the biggest year class in this time period from the early 1990s onward. 2012 is the next one after 2005. And in between there, we've got 6 low recruitments in a row. And that's what's driving this current decline in spawning biomass. We basically got dealt 6 bad hands in a row. And then 2012, well, pretty good, about average of what we were seeing from the late 90s to 2005, but not as big as 2005 and not big enough to appreciably change the trajectory of the stock. We're now starting to get a better read on the 2014 year class as well. 2013 doesn't look like much, and 2014, although it's better than 2006 to 2011, still doesn't look very good. So I know there was some hope. 2014 was the first year of really warm water in the Gulf of Alaska, which had negative effects on Pacific cod, but it actually seems to have fairly positive effects on sablefish. And so we were quite interested to see what 2014 would look like for Pacific halibut. And it turns out okay, but not great, is the takeaway. After 2014, we just have very little information yet. So those observations are highly variable at this point, and I wouldn't put much credence in them until we see these fish a couple more times. Now, I want to put this in context because, on this graph, okay, it looks like 6 low years. It doesn't look that bad. But if we look at the bigger picture, sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. Before I do that, let me just walk you through how the information evolves on these year classes. So this is just using one model and backing off, taking a year of data off, rerunning the model, taking a year of data off. And as we back up in time, if we go back to 2017 data only, we didn't have any indication of the 2012 year class. Then a year later in 2018, well, we could start to see them a little better. And then, whoops, lost the whole. Don't think I did that. Maybe they could put me back in presenting mode. Then in 2019, with data through 2019, we actually had a pretty good estimate of the 2012 year class. So those fish were 7 years old. When we first got a good idea that was going to be a better year class than the years leading up to it. And so that's how this plays out. And that's because we don't see these fish, as I pointed out, in the commercial fishery until they're even older. And this particular year class, because we had such small year classes leading up, we could really see this one coming. It's a little harder when we have multiple year classes in the water. Okay, now I want to put this low recruitment in context. So this is our best reconstruction using 2 of the 4 models, looking back 100 years of recruitment. And you can see right away that 1987 year class is more than twice as big as the next largest year class in that time series. And although I certainly wouldn't put a lot of credence in the recruitment estimates before about 1940, you can see the uncertainty intervals are very broad on those. We do have catch at age going back to about 1935. So once you get into the 40s, 50s, and 60s, you see those uncertainty intervals come way down. We actually have a pretty good estimate of what was being caught back then, even right down to the age of those fish. If we go back in time and look for another period when we had 6 low recruitments, we have to go all the way back into the late 1960s and early 1970s to see that. And those are the recruitments that led to that really low yield in the late 1970s. So this is a pretty big dip in recruitment. This 6 years in a row is not something that we've seen in a long, long time for the fishery. So it's good to see 2012 and 2014 coming after it, but this is definitely a period of low productivity compared to the average recruitment that we have seen over a bunch of decades leading up to this. Now, the last couple slides on the stock assessment. The first one is, how do we measure the effect of fishing? And we do that by doing a replay of the stock and estimating how many fish, how much biomass would be in the water if we hadn't been fishing. So we account for all the fish that were taken out. We effectively put them back in the stock, and we account for the fact that had they been there, they might have actually produced more recruitment as well. So we include that in the analysis. And this upper graphic here shows you the time series that we estimate for spawning biomass in the absence of any fishing. So of course, this isn't staying constant over time. It changes even when we're not fishing on it. It changes due to fluctuations in recruitment. It changes due to changes in weighted age. And so the Pacific halibut stock, being as dynamic as it is, can go up or down substantially, even without any effect of fishing operating on the stock. The bottom series shows you the estimate of spawning biomass that we think has actually occurred. And again, this is now including recruitment and weighted age, but it's also including the effects of fishing. And by comparing these two curves, we can estimate the effect of fishing at any particular time. We can ask the question, well, how much did fishing drop the stock versus other factors? And if we go back to the peak of the biomass, we were knocking the stock down by approximately 43% due to fishing. So that was at the peak biomass in the late 1990s. If we go to a period, say 2011, we were actually reducing the stock by about 70% in 2011. So we were fishing the stock pretty hard. The effect of fishing was large in 2011. This was actually the year in which the fishing had the largest effect on the spawning biomass in this time series. If we compare at the end of the time series, we see that that's now decreased, and we've reduced the stock in 2024 by 58% due to fishing. So a little bit more than we were at the peak, but not as much as we were in 2011. However, you'll also note that the biomass in 2024, the estimated spawning biomass, is at the lowest point effectively in this entire time series. So the stock is low because of some factors that don't have to do with fishing, as well as the effect of fishing pushing the stock down. And that's how we measure, that's how we find the relative effect of both of those components, natural biological processes and fishing, and balance those two things out. So this graphic shows you a summary of some of the reference points for the stock, and I won't go through them all. It's a useful place just to get all of the reference points, but I'll highlight two things. The first is the SPR that we estimate for 2023. This is the fishing intensity. So how much would we be reducing the long-term reproductive output of the stock? So not the specific year, but in the long term, how hard are we fishing, and what would that effect have on the long-term reproductive output of the stock? And that's an SPR of 52%, which you'll recall is actually less fishing intensity than we've seen is sustainable from our MSC results. From the MSC, we find that we could actually fish the stock harder than that over the long term, and the stock would still be sustainable. So we're below the levels that we think are probably sustainable for this stock. But we are at a period of low productivity, so we've also got a small stock size right now. As I mentioned in the previous graphic, the effect of fishing on the stock has reduced it by 58%. So turn that around, our relative biomass is 42%. We're at 42% of the biomass that we would estimate to have been in the water if we hadn't been fishing on the stock. So that's just a couple of the reference points to note here. This table's in the summary document as well as in this slide for your review. To summarize these assessment results, the big unexpected point this year was the drop in fishery CPUE from 2022 to 2023. This drop pulled the whole stock assessment result down somewhat compared to last year's stock assessment. The 2012 and 2014 year classes, although they are better than we had during 2006 to 2011, they're not great. They're basically just enough to keep us where we are. We can either keep the catch stable and have more or less the same biomass, maybe slightly more over the next couple of years, Or we could have a slight fishery increase, but that would lead to a slightly lower stock over the next several years. But we can't get both out of the stock right now. And that's just based on the fish that are already in the water. It's not counting on any fish in the future. These are the 2 year classes that will be most important over the next several years. In terms of what is coming in the future, although we have some information from trawl survey and other data, it's going to be several more years until we see those fish. And so if we can't see them, we really aren't banking on them for the fishery or the fish either. So it's going to be several more years until the current trajectory of the stock changes appreciably. And so with that, I recommend that the commission note this paper, providing a summary. And also remind you that we have an additional presentation that I believe we'll take tomorrow morning, which covers the stock projections over the next 3 years. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Stewart. Questions? Yeah.
Thanks, Dr. Stewart. I just had a couple relatively specific questions about slide 32, the historical recruitment estimates. And so a couple of the things stood out to me about this slide. The first is that the estimates of recruitment in the more recent part of the time series look a lot more variable. And I'm assuming maybe that's because we just have better data about them and we're estimating what they were historically, but I'm curious if you could sort of explain that a bit. And then part 2 of my question is, I was also a bit surprised that they don't really look that different, with the exception of, as you noted, some very big year classes. And maybe is that just a function of the scale, because we have to make room for a couple of year classes? Like, you know, if I were to average different time periods here, they look like they would end up being pretty close to one another. So is that just my bad sort of eyeballing, or something else?
Yeah, thanks for the question. So I'll start with the first part in terms of uncertainty. You can see this period centered on 1960, where we have pretty tight confidence intervals on those estimates. The way this works is that when the recruitments are very small, we get a pretty good estimate because we catch most of them and they're pretty easy to estimate. The bigger they get, the harder they are to estimate. So we know 87 was huge, but it's also got a huge confidence interval on it. I would say that halibut is kind of unique in that even though we don't have a good survey trend going back before the early 90s, we have an incredible catch at age data set. So we have a huge number of otoliths that have been read. And I think Basha had the number earlier. It's something like 1.5 million or more, going all the way back to the 1930s. So this is pretty atypical for a stock to be able to estimate a 100-year series of relatively precise recruitment estimates. In terms of the average of the recruitment during these time periods, the biggest part of the signal, so I didn't mention it when I showed this figure, but the PDO phases are shown on here as well. And that PDO phase that includes the 1987 year class and all those around it was a positive phase of the PDO. And so if you just compare that one to the period during the 1960s, the average recruitment in those 2 periods was pretty dramatically different. It was much, much higher in the positive PDO phase that started in 1977 and ran through, I forget, 2009-ish. And so that's where the bulk of that signal comes from for the PDO relationship. The earlier period before 1947, I would say take that with a grain of salt because that's early in our age data. And at the end of the time series, it's really hard to tell because we have a short low PDO period and a short positive period. But as I mentioned, the relationship with other environmental variables seems to be getting somewhat messy in recent years. It's not holding up the same way it has. So I don't know actually in the long term whether the PDO will continue to be a useful covariate with recruitment or not. I think that remains to be seen. And unfortunately, it's going to take a while for us to realize if it's not working. So that's partly why we don't, I would say we don't count on the PDO to tell us what's coming. I show it as a point of interest, but we've built these models such that they don't rely on the PDO to predict recruitment. And our projections don't rely on recruitments more than 3 years don't go more than 3 years in advance. So they don't rely on recruitments we haven't seen yet.
Bob?
Dr. Stewart, in a recent filing by the Amendment 80 fleet, they suggest that the stock of the halibut resource is not quite as dire as one might think. But when I look at your comments on the 30-year spawning biomass and our reliance on the 2012 year class, I'm concerned. What is your observation on this?
Well, thanks for the question, Commissioner. I would call your eye to the estimated spawning biomass in this figure. Although we don't currently estimate that fishing is having a large effect on the stock, you can see that we are at the lowest biomass since the early 1990s. So we're at a 35-year low right now in terms of the biomass of fish that are in the water, and in an absolute measure of biomass. And so although we're not triggering our reference points in terms of being in the conservation zone per se, we haven't seen a stock size this low in a long time. And because of that, I think there is increased risk. As well, as I mentioned, we have basically just two important year classes in the water right now, and no clear indication in our survey or our fishery data of another strong year class coming. And so we don't have, at the moment, any short-term prospect for an appreciable change in biomass. So I would expect us to continue to be at or near the lowest biomass since the early 90s for the next several years.
Thank you.
Other questions? Peter?
A couple of questions, just for clarification. 3-year average of non-directed discards, does that include Canada as well? Do we use a 3-year average for the non-directed discards as well?
Yes, that's correct. So that was the commission decision, I believe. I don't remember the year now.
I think it was the last.
Several years ago. But we've opted to use the 3-year running average as the predictor of the upcoming year.
Okay. Yeah. Okay, thank you. And then a little bit about the feedback loop, and then considering the 2012 and, the 2014, and what that, you were talking about, you're fishing more of the females and that has a negative loop. Maybe can you just explain that a little more for me?
I can, and thanks for the question. This is some new information that I added since the interim meeting. I'll note as well that there is a longer data overview document that's available on the stock assessment website that has some of these other figures in it that aren't in the summary document associated with the AM meeting. So if you want to see more detail on some of this, that information is available. The particular figure I think you were referring to, and I won't try to get back to it now, is the relationship between average age and the sex ratio. And I think that is something that we're just starting to understand more fully. It's kind of a surprisingly strong relationship. I mean, maybe not surprising, and now that we see it, but the younger the fish we catch, the higher the fraction female. And so, as we've discussed in many meetings, the females are how we measure the reproductive output of the stock. And so catching more females, effectively catching more males, comes for free. This doesn't affect our reference points. But as we start to tilt the fishery toward more and more females, we can end up in a situation where the same amount of catch can have a larger effect on the stock. Now, we measure that through using SPR. It accounts for that. But that is something that I think is potentially playing into where we are now, in that the 2012 year class is only, will be 12 years old in this upcoming fishery season, and that's not fully mature. I have a slide on that in my projections presentation, but we're catching young fish that are still going to grow, and by catching them young, we actually catch more females than we would if they grew longer.
Which kind of reduces our...
Which is that negative feedback loop.
Yeah. Okay, thank you very much. And then one last question, and it was actually specific to a slide. Slide 16, and it looked to me that it was a size at age, and it looked to me that possibly the 2012 year class is kind of flattening out there now, whereas maybe at one point we thought that it would continue to rise. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for the question. And I apologize. I guess I could have included another line on here at age 11, which would have given us a better read on the 2012 year class. Again, there's more information on the website. You can look at our detailed fishery independent setline survey trends by individual age. But I think you may be right. We are certainly seeing a slight flattening out of the trends we'd been seeing for a couple of years. So we'll see. The other thing to remember, though, is that we didn't have fully comprehensive coverage on the survey in 2023. And so there is the potential that some of what we're seeing, is particularly in 2023, is an artifact of where we were sampling. So we got the biology from basically all of the areas, but not necessarily spread uniformly across each area. So our design was a little spotty as we got into 3A, and particularly out in the west and in the north. So I don't know to the degree to which we might get maybe more information next year that might change these trends a little bit.
Okay, yeah, because you've mentioned in the past that some of the size and age ratios are different in different regions. So that would explain why.
Yes, we certainly see strong patterns. We tend to see much less change in size at age in Region 4. Region 3 has the most pronounced patterns, and Region 2 has some pattern, but the fish in Region 2 tend to, on average, be much larger for their age than in other regions.
Thank you very much. Paul, did you have a question?
Thanks very much for the presentation, Dr. Stewart. I'd like to go back to slide 35, and it's your second bullet. And I guess your comments around that bullet is what I was hearing was that if we stay within the range of what we've been harvesting in recent years, and I'm interpreting that as the last 11 years, for example, which has been around average 39 million pounds. And I guess the low has been 36.6 and high has been 45.5. So you're saying that you wouldn't expect big changes if we stayed within a range of something in that order to the biomass?
Yes, that's correct. So our current estimate is that yields up to 39.1 million pounds, and I'll speak to this a little more tomorrow, but yields up to approximately 39 million pounds should have at least a 50-50 chance of keeping the stock where it is now.
Yeah, okay, so we'll see that tomorrow. Okay, yeah. Thanks.
So Dr. Stewart, I'm trying to get a peek at maybe some hopeful information out of the 16 to 19 year classes. And I heard earlier that maybe the sport fishery begins to see these fish earlier. Do we get otolith readings, aging information out of the sport fishery at all, or linked to the age and something like that to give us a peek?
Yes, thank you, Commissioner, for the question. In fact, I haven't included it in this presentation, but we do. Alaska Department of Fish and Game collects otoliths from the charter fishery in IPHC Regulatory Area 3A, and I believe most recently in 2023, a few otoliths from 2C as well. We have been using the 3A otoliths for some time. We have an agreement where we do the aging, and then they collect the otoliths, we age them, send them back, and they do the weighting based on the port sampling programs. And so we actually do include that information in the stock assessment. Unfortunately, I don't have a graphic of it here, but the recreational fishery in 3A does appear to be seeing some 2016 fish. And the reason that I have 2016 to 2018 is because there is some discrepancy. It looks like there's some 2016 fish in the recreational data, but the trawl data really look more like 2017s and 2018s. And so it's really unclear whether some of that is because we're using age length keys, particularly for the trawl data, to convert a large number of lengths into ages. So maybe we're off a little bit by a year or two. And that's why I'm reporting here a range of 16 to 18. But yes, there is some indication in the recreational data of a 2016 year class.
Any other questions? Okay. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Stewart. Dave, I'll turn to you.
Thank you, Chair. So we have the end of today's agenda completed, which means that tomorrow morning we will move on to the presentation from Dr. Hicks on management strategy evaluation. Before we recap on the projections that Dr. Stewart was just speaking of as well, and also Dr. Webster in terms of the survey evaluation papers. So that means that we have an opportunity to wrap up a little bit early today. We do have the IPHC 100th reception, which is going to commence at 7 p.m. tonight. The doors will open and it will be in all of these rooms. I'm going to pass to Andrea just to talk a little bit about the events for this evening, just so you're aware of what's going to happen when, and that so you don't miss out on any of the activities. And just as part of that, I wanted to thank the contracting parties for contributing substantial funds to host and fund the function this evening, and then also our industry partners who have gathered and supported the process. So over to you, Andrea.
Awesome. And thank you, Dr. Wilson. So I just want to make sure to invite you to the IPHC 100-year anniversary reception tonight, again at 7 p.m. in the foredeck. So right next door. And a big thank you, as Dr. Wilson said, to the Planning Committee, Commissioner Yamada, Dimitri Vargas from the State Department, and Felicia Cull from DFO Canada. Not only did they bring some amazing and fun ideas, but they made sure that we had the funds to plan a great event. So doors open at 7 p.m. The program starts at 7:45 with a short celebration and guest speakers. Come hungry. We have a prime rib station, halibut, shrimp, reindeer stuffed mushrooms, and come thirsty. We have a full bar and we look forward to buying you your first 2 beers or wines. And be ready for fun. We've got a fun game to play. And thank you again to the industry partners who have secured amazing door prizes. Make sure to come right at 7 o'clock because those door prizes will start. And some of you are going to win big. Lastly, we have live music by the band Pamua, an Inuit soul band. So again, doors open at 7 and we look forward to celebrating 100 years with you tonight. Thank you.
And just before we break, I did want to highlight on the agenda, we have an opportunity for public comments and questions first thing in the morning, right? So if folks have questions on presentations from today or other information, please bring them in the morning. And with that, I think we're adjourned for the evening. We'll see you at the reception.